"If you don't want to go to a nursing home, pack your bags and get out of my house." Those were the exact words. Not from a stranger, not from an enemy, from my son, the child I gave birth to, the boy I raised alone after his father died, the same little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, crying for me to hold him tight, the same teenager who swore at his high school graduation that everything he ever became would be because of me, the same man who stood at the altar on his wedding day and thanked me in front of 200 guests for sacrificing everything so he could have a better life. That man, my son, standing in the living room of the house I bought with my own money, pointing his finger at me like I was garbage he needed to dispose of. His wife stood behind him with her arms crossed, nodding in agreement like she was directing the whole performance. My grandchildren, his 2 daughters, were conveniently at school, spared from witnessing what their father had become. I didn't scream back. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't remind him of every sacrifice, every double shift I worked at the hospital, every birthday cake I baked from scratch because store-bought was too expensive, every college tuition payment I made while eating ramen noodles for dinner. I didn't throw his ingratitude in his face or remind him that this house he was throwing me out of was actually my house, with my name on the deed. I didn't tell him that the reason he had such a comfortable life, such a high-paying career, such a beautiful family, was because I gave up everything, including my own dreams, to make sure he never went without. I didn't do any of that. Instead, I did something he never expected. Something that changed everything. I smiled. Not a sad smile. Not a bitter smile. A real, genuine smile that came from somewhere deep inside me, from a place of knowledge he couldn't begin to understand. I walked to my bedroom, opened my suitcase, the same navy blue Samsonite I'd had for 20 years, and began to pack. Slowly, deliberately, with the kind of calm that comes from knowing something he didn't. I folded each blouse with precision. I rolled my sweaters, the way travel experts recommend to save space. I packed my medications in a clear bag. I selected my favorite jewelry, including the pearl earrings my late husband gave me on our 10th anniversary. I chose 3 photographs from my dresser, just 3, the ones that mattered most. I could hear my son and his wife whispering in the hallway, probably surprised I wasn't putting up a fight, probably relieved they wouldn't have to physically remove me or call the authorities. They had no idea what was about to happen. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully disposed of the burden I had apparently become. Exactly 1 hour later, and I mean exactly 60 minutes from the moment those cruel words left his mouth, a limousine pulled up to the curb. Not a taxi, not an Uber, not a friend's sedan, a limousine. A sleek, black, luxury limousine with tinted windows and chrome detailing that reflected the afternoon sunlight. The kind of vehicle that makes neighbors peek through their curtains. The kind that doesn't belong in ordinary suburban neighborhoods where people drive minivans and sedans. I heard it before I saw it, that quiet, powerful engine sound that only expensive cars make. I was standing in the foyer with my packed suitcase at my feet, my purse over my shoulder, wearing my best coat, the cashmere one I'd been saving for special occasions. My son and his wife were in the kitchen, probably planning how they'd convert my bedroom into a home office or gym. When my son heard the car door close outside, he came to the window. When he saw that limousine parked in front of his house, his expression shifted from confusion to curiosity. When the driver, dressed in full uniform, stepped out and walked toward our front door, my son's curiosity turned to concern. When I opened the door before the driver could even knock, when the driver greeted me by name, "Mrs. Hartwell, your car is ready." When he took my suitcase with white-gloved hands, my son's concern transformed into something else entirely. He rushed to the door. He called my name. "Mom, wait, what is this? Who is that? Where are you going?" His wife appeared behind him, her arms no longer crossed, her face full of questions she didn't know how to ask. I turned to face them one last time before stepping off that porch. When my son opened that door wider and saw who had come for me, when he saw who was sitting in the back of that limousine waiting, when recognition finally dawned on his face, his expression did something I'd never seen before. His face didn't just go pale, it went white, like he'd seen a ghost, like every drop of blood had drained from his body in an instant. His mouth opened but no words came out. His hand gripped the doorframe like he needed it to stay upright. His wife asked what was wrong. "Who is that? David, what's happening?" But he couldn't answer her. He just stood there, frozen, watching me walk down the path toward that limousine, toward the person inside who represented everything he'd forgotten, everything he'd underestimated, everything he never knew about my life before he existed. And in a way, He had seen a ghost. The ghost of the woman I used to be before I became just mom. Before I became just the elderly mother he saw as a burden. Before I became just the problem he needed to solve by shipping me off to a nursing home. He was seeing the Margaret Eleanor Hartwell who existed before he was born, the woman with connections he never knew about, with a past he'd never asked about, with relationships and resources and power he'd never imagined. In that moment, watching me slide into that limousine next to someone he recognized, someone important, someone he'd only ever seen on television or in newspapers, he realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake. You could see it in his eyes. The exact second he understood that he'd just thrown out the wrong person. My name is Margaret Eleanor Hartwell. I'm 68 years old. And this is the story of how I lost my son, found myself, and discovered that sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who suffer the biggest shock. This is the story of secrets kept for decades, of a past I never spoke about, of relationships that shaped history, and of one phone call that changed everything. This is the story of what happened when my son thought he knew everything about me and learned he knew nothing at all. Stay with me until the end of this, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about the elderly people in your own life. And if you don't watch until the very end, you'll miss the moment when my son finally learned the truth. And trust me, you don't want to miss that. Before we go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before I tell you who was in that limousine, you need to understand something. This didn't happen overnight. The son who screamed at me that day, who pointed his finger at me like I was trash, who told me to pack my bags and get out. He wasn't always that way. There was a time when David was the kindest, most thoughtful man you could ever meet. He called me every Sunday when he lived across the country for his first job. He sent flowers on Mother's Day without fail. He flew home for my birthday, even when he could barely afford the plane ticket. He introduced me to his girlfriends and actually cared about my opinion. He was the son every mother dreams of having, the kind of man who opened doors for strangers and volunteered at soup kitchens during the holidays. People in our community used to stop me at the grocery store just to tell me what a wonderful job I'd done raising him. Teachers, neighbors, his friends' parents, they all said the same thing. You must be so proud, Margaret. He's such a good man. And I was proud. So incredibly proud. But looking back now, I can see exactly when things changed. It wasn't gradual at first. There was a specific moment, a turning point I can identify with absolute precision. It was 3 years ago, at a Thanksgiving dinner. When he brought her home. Vanessa, that was her name. Vanessa Thornton, soon to be Vanessa Hartwell, though I didn't know it at the time. She walked into my house wearing designer clothes and carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She had perfectly manicured nails, the kind that make clicking sounds on phone screens. Her hair was salon perfect, highlighted and styled in that way that requires standing appointments and significant money. She smiled at me with impossibly white teeth and said all the right things. How lovely to finally meet you. David has told me so much about you. What a beautiful home you have. Can I help with anything in the kitchen? But her eyes told a different story. Her eyes scanned my living room like an appraiser, evaluating merchandise. She looked at my furniture, my curtains, my framed photographs, my modest decorations, and I could see her mentally calculating, judging, finding everything insufficient. During dinner, she asked questions that seemed polite on the surface but had edges underneath. So you've lived here how long, Margaret? And you're still working at the hospital at your age? Don't you find it exhausting? Have you thought about what you'll do when you retire? David told me you've been alone since his father passed. That must be so difficult, managing everything by yourself. Each question felt like a probe, searching for weakness, looking for vulnerability. David didn't notice. He was too busy looking at her like she'd hung the moon. He'd been in relationships before, but never like this, never with this kind of intensity. He was completely captivated, utterly under her spell, blind to everything except his infatuation with this woman, who I instinctively knew was going to change our lives. 6 months later, they were engaged. 3 months after that, married in a ceremony that cost more than my annual salary, though I wasn't asked to contribute and wouldn't have been able to if I had been. Vanessa's family paid for everything, made sure everyone knew they'd paid for everything, and treated David like he'd married up, which I suppose in financial terms he had. Her father owned a successful real estate development company. Her mother sat on charity boards and hosted fundraisers. Her brother was a lawyer at a prestigious firm. They had money, connections, country club memberships, vacation homes. And they looked at my son, a middle management project coordinator at a tech company, like he was lucky to be joining their family. I watched David start to change at that wedding. The way he stood a little straighter around Vanessa's relatives. The way he laughed at jokes that weren't funny. The way he started using words like networking and optics and brand. That should have been my first real warning. 2 months after the wedding, David called me. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something. Vanessa and I have been discussing our situation. We're trying to save money for a house, and rent in the city is astronomical. I know you have that extra bedroom since I moved out. Would you mind if we stayed with you? Just temporarily, maybe 6 months, just until we can save up a proper down payment?" He sounded apologetic, almost embarrassed, like the old David who wouldn't want to impose. And what was I supposed to say? This was my son, my only child. Of course I said yes. Of course I told him I'd be happy to have them, that it would be nice to have people in the house again, that 6 months was no problem at all. I meant it too. I genuinely looked forward to having family around, to getting to know my new daughter-in-law better, to maybe building a relationship with her. I cleaned out the guest bedroom, bought new sheets, cleared space in the closets. I prepared a welcome dinner for their first night. I wanted them to feel at home. They moved in on a Saturday in March. By Sunday, Vanessa was rearranging my kitchen. Not asking permission, not suggesting improvements, just moving things. She put my coffee mugs in a different cabinet because it makes more sense near the coffee maker, Margaret. She relocated my spices because they should be alphabetized, don't you think? She replaced my dish soap with an organic brand because the chemicals in regular soap are terrible for your skin. Within a week, she'd reorganized my entire living room. Your furniture arrangement was blocking the natural flow of the space. I consulted with an interior designer friend, and she suggested this configuration. It's much better, don't you agree? I didn't agree, but I didn't argue either. I told myself it was temporary. 6 months. I could adapt for 6 months. Besides, David seemed happy. And wasn't that what mattered? Wasn't my son's happiness worth a little inconvenience? 6 months came and went. No mention of moving out. No house hunting updates. No timeline discussions. When I gently asked David about their plans, he got defensive. "We're still saving, Mom. The housing market is crazy right now. You said we could stay here. Are you trying to kick us out? Is this house suddenly not big enough for your own son?" That stung. I backed off immediately, assured him I wasn't trying to pressure them, told him to take all the time they needed. Vanessa stood behind him during that conversation, saying nothing, but wearing this small smile that made my stomach turn. She knew exactly what she was doing. She'd planted seeds in my son's mind, twisted the narrative so that my reasonable question became me being unreasonable. That was her talent. Making herself the victim, making David her defender, making me the problem. The shift from gratitude to entitlement happened so gradually I almost didn't notice until it was too late. At first, they contributed to groceries. Then Vanessa started buying only organic specialty items that quadrupled the food budget, and somehow I ended up paying the difference. They offered to help with utilities. Then the bills started arriving higher because Vanessa needed the house at 72 degrees year-round. And again, I absorbed the cost. David used to help with yard work and repairs. Then he was too busy with work projects, too tired on weekends, too involved in Vanessa's social calendar. My house became their house. My space became their space. My life became background noise in their story. And the worst part? David didn't even see it happening. What Michael didn't know, what I'd never told him, was that this house, this modest 3-bedroom ranch in a middle-class neighborhood, it wasn't the only property I owned. But we'll get to that. Because that secret, among others, was about to become very important. That secret was sitting in the back of a limousine, waiting for me. That secret was the reason my son's face went white as a sheet when he saw who had come to collect me. But you need to understand the full picture first. You need to see how far things fell before you can appreciate how high they're about to rise. Let me take you back to that morning. Tuesday, September 14th. I remember the date with absolute clarity because it was my late husband's birthday. Robert would have been 71 years old. Every year since he died, I've honored this day the same way. I wake up early, before anyone else in the house, and I sit with his photograph for a few minutes. Just sit. Sometimes I talk to him. Sometimes I just remember. That morning, I told him about what was happening. I told him about David, about Vanessa, about how our son had changed into someone we wouldn't recognize. I told him I felt invisible in my own home. I told him I didn't know how much longer I could endure being treated like a burden instead of a person. And then I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I opened my bedside drawer and took out an old business card, yellowed at the edges, with a phone number I'd memorized decades ago but never forgotten. I held that card in my hands for a long time, debating, wondering if it was finally time. My morning routine hadn't changed in years. I've always been an early riser, a habit from my nursing days when I worked the opening shift at County Memorial Hospital. Even after retirement, my body still wakes at 5:30 without an alarm. I shower, dress in comfortable clothes. Nothing fancy, because Vanessa had made it clear that my style was outdated and frankly embarrassing when her friends visited. I go to the kitchen and start breakfast. Not just for myself. For 3 people. For my son and his wife, who had been living under my roof for 3 years in what was supposed to be a temporary arrangement. I make coffee in the old percolator because David used to love the smell of it brewing. I prepare eggs, toast, fruit, sometimes pancakes on weekends. I set the table with 3 place settings, 3 napkins, 3 glasses of orange juice. It's a ritual I've maintained because it makes me feel useful, like I'm still contributing something to their lives, even if they don't appreciate it. That morning, I made scrambled eggs with cheese, the way David liked them as a child. I toasted whole grain bread because Vanessa insisted on it, even though it tasted like cardboard to me. I arranged fresh strawberries in a bowl, washed and hulled. I poured juice. I set everything out nicely, the way my mother taught me, because presentation matters, because even small things should be done with care. Then I sat down and waited. And waited. The eggs started to get cold. The toast lost its warmth. The coffee began to develop that bitter taste it gets when it sits too long. I checked the clock. 7:30 became 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock became 8:30. I knew they were awake because I could hear the shower running upstairs, could hear Vanessa's voice talking on her phone, could hear their bedroom door opening and closing. They just weren't coming down. Or more accurately, they weren't coming down while I was there. I'd noticed this pattern developing over the past few months. They'd wait until I left the kitchen before coming down for breakfast. They'd make their own coffee, grab protein bars or smoothies, completely ignore the meal I'd prepared. Sometimes I'd find the eggs scraped into the garbage disposal hours later, the toast fed to the birds outside. At first, I thought maybe they weren't hungry in the mornings. Then I realized it was intentional. They were avoiding me. My presence at breakfast had become something they didn't want. I was an inconvenience, an obligation, an elderly woman they had to navigate around in the house that was supposed to be theirs. So that morning, I did what I'd been doing. I finished my own breakfast, cleaned my plate, and retreated to the living room with a book, making myself scarce so they could have their space. Within minutes, I heard them come downstairs. David's heavy footsteps, Vanessa's lighter ones in those expensive slippers she wore. I heard cabinet doors opening, the refrigerator closing, their quiet conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. They sounded happy, relaxed, like my absence had lifted a weight from the atmosphere. I sat in my chair, the one Robert used to sit in, and pretended to read while listening to my son and his wife enjoy their morning without me. They didn't call out a greeting, didn't ask if I wanted more coffee, didn't acknowledge my existence at all. I'd become invisible in my own home, a ghost haunting rooms that used to belong to me. I thought about all the mornings I'd woken David up for school, made his breakfast, packed his lunch, sent him off with encouragement and love. I thought about how he used to hug me before leaving, tell me I was the best mom in the world, promise he'd make me proud someday. That little boy felt like a stranger now. The small dismissals and microaggressions had become so constant, I'd almost stopped noticing them. Almost. Vanessa would walk into a room and immediately open windows because it smells stuffy in here. Margaret, when do you last air this place out? She'd rearrange items I placed somewhere, shake her head, say things like, I don't understand your organizational system, it's so chaotic. She'd pick up my book and glance at the cover with barely concealed disdain. Romance novels at your age? Don't you want to read something more substantial? She'd comment on my clothes. That sweater is very colorful, isn't it? Very bold choice. She'd watch me eat and make observations. Should you be having butter, Margaret? I read that dairy is terrible for bone density in older women. Every comment delivered with a smile, with concern, with plausible deniability. If I objected, I'd be the sensitive one, the difficult one, the old woman who couldn't take helpful suggestions. David had started joining in, though his comments were less direct. He'd sigh heavily when I asked him questions. He'd get irritated when I needed help with technology. Mom, I showed you how to use the remote 3 times already. Can you please just write it down? He'd make plans without telling me, then get annoyed when I'd already started cooking dinner. We're eating out tonight. Didn't I mention that? You should really check with us before making a whole meal. He'd talk about me in third person while I was in the room. She always keeps the house so cold, doesn't she? I think she forgets to adjust the thermostat. He'd stopped asking about my day, my health, my life. I existed solely as an obstacle to be managed, a responsibility he resented having to bear. Around 10:30 that morning, I was in my bedroom folding laundry when I heard them in the hallway just outside my door. They thought I couldn't hear them, or maybe they didn't care anymore. Vanessa's voice came through clearly. We need to make a decision about this, David. We can't keep putting it off. David's response was quieter, harder to make out. I moved closer to the door, ashamed of eavesdropping but unable to stop myself. Vanessa continued. She's getting older, babe. What if she falls? What if something happens while we're at work? We could be liable. Think about the lawsuit potential. Think about our future. We can't sacrifice everything because you feel guilty. There was a long pause. I held my breath, waiting for my son to defend me, to tell his wife that I was his mother and deserved better than being discussed like a liability issue. David's response, when it came, shattered something inside me. I know. You're right. I've been thinking about it too. There's that facility over on Oakmont Drive, Sunrise Senior Living. It's supposed to be really nice. They have activities, medical staff on site, communal dining. She might actually be happier there. Vanessa jumped on his words immediately. Exactly. She'd have people her own age to socialize with. She wouldn't be stuck here alone all day. It's really the kindest thing we could do for her. And David, think about us. We could finally have the house to ourselves. We could turn her bedroom into the home office you've been wanting. We could have friends over without worrying about disturbing her. We could actually live our lives. Another pause. Then David, sounding almost convinced. Let me look into the costs. See what our options are. Maybe we can tour a few places next week. That's when I knew. My son wasn't planning to care for me in my old age the way I'd cared for him throughout his childhood. He wasn't planning to repay the sacrifice and devotion I'd given him for 42 years. He was planning to dispose of me, to ship me off to a facility where I'd be someone else's problem, where he could visit on holidays if he felt obligated, where he could tell himself he'd done the right thing while living in my house and enjoying the freedom of my absence. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I sat down on my bed, hands shaking, heart racing, mind spinning with hurt and anger and disbelief. This was really happening. My son was really going to abandon me. I tried to compose myself. I took deep breaths. I reminded myself that I'd survived worse than this. I'd survived my husband's sudden death from a heart attack 15 years ago. I'd survived raising a child alone. I'd survived financial struggles and health scares and loneliness. I could survive this too. But as I stood up to continue folding laundry, to maintain some sense of normalcy, my hands were trembling. Not from age, not from weakness, from the overwhelming emotion of betrayal and grief. I picked up a plate I'd brought to my room the night before, one of my good china plates from the set Robert and I received as a wedding gift. I was carrying it to the kitchen when my shaking hands lost their grip. The plate fell. It seemed to fall in slow motion, tumbling through the air before shattering against the hardwood floor with a crash that echoed through the house. Pieces scattered everywhere, shards of delicate porcelain spreading across the hallway. I stood frozen, staring at the broken remains of something that had survived 45 years of use, only to break now, in this moment, like a metaphor I didn't want to acknowledge. Within seconds, Vanessa appeared from the living room. She looked at the broken plate, looked at me, and her expression shifted into something I can only describe as triumphant satisfaction. See? This is exactly what I'm talking about. She didn't ask if I was okay. Didn't check if I'd cut myself on the sharp edges, didn't offer to help clean up. She just stood there, making her point, using my moment of emotional vulnerability as evidence for her case. David came around the corner, saw the mess, saw his wife's expression, saw me standing there with tears. I was trying desperately to hold back. "Mom, are you all right?" For a brief second, I heard concern in his voice. For a brief second, he was my son again. But then Vanessa touched his arm, gave him a meaningful look, and I watched him shut down. "Yeah, it's fine. Just be more careful, okay? Those plates are irreplaceable." He didn't help clean up either. They both just walked away, leaving me standing in a hallway full of broken china that represented everything shattered between us. I got the broom and dustpan. I swept up every piece, careful not to miss any shards that could cut bare feet later. I threw away fragments of a plate that had served Sunday dinners and holiday meals and ordinary Tuesday breakfasts for decades. And something inside me hardened. I excused myself, told them I was going to lie down, told them I had a headache. I went to my bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of my bed and took out that business card again. The one I'd been looking at that morning. The one I'd kept hidden in my drawer for 15 years. The one that connected me to a life I'd left behind, to a person I'd been before I became just David's mother, just Robert's widow, just the elderly woman taking up space in what used to be her own home. I stared at that number for a long time. My hands were still shaking, but not from weakness, from decision, from the moment of choice that determines everything that comes after. I made a phone call that morning. Just one. To someone I hadn't spoken to in 15 years. Someone who represented everything I'd walked away from, everything I'd sacrificed, everything David knew nothing about. The phone rang 3 times. I almost hung up, but then a voice answered. A voice I'd recognize anywhere. A voice that belonged to someone who knew Margaret Eleanor Hartwell before she became invisible. That call lasted exactly 12 minutes. When it ended, everything had changed. The wheels were already in motion for what would happen later that day, for the limousine that would arrive, for the moment my son's face would go white with recognition and horror. That call would change everything. But David and Vanessa, eating lunch in my kitchen, planning my removal to a nursing home, had no idea what was coming. They had no idea who I really was. They were about to find out. It happened at 2:47 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock on the mantel, the one my husband bought me on our 10th anniversary. Robert had found it at an antique shop in downtown Charleston during a business trip, paid more than we could afford at the time. But he said every time I looked at it, I should remember that our love was timeless, that some things were worth the investment. That clock had ticked through 45 years of my life, through births and deaths and ordinary Tuesday afternoons, through moments of joy and sorrow and everything in between. It had never stopped, never faltered, just kept marking time with mechanical indifference to the human drama unfolding beneath it. And now it was marking the moment when everything I'd built with my son came crashing down. 2:47. The exact minute my son became a stranger. I'd been in my bedroom for nearly 3 hours since making that phone call, since speaking to someone I hadn't contacted in 15 years, since setting in motion events that would change everything. I'd been sitting on the edge of my bed, hands folded in my lap, breathing slowly, preparing myself for what I knew was coming, because I'd heard them downstairs. Their voices had carried up through the heating vents, through the old house's thin walls, fragments of conversation that told me they were working up their courage. Vanessa's voice, insistent and sharp, David's voice, uncertain but hardening under her influence. The sound of papers rustling, the laptop keyboard clicking, the printer humming. They were preparing something. Building a case. Getting ready to present me with a decision that wasn't really a decision at all, but an ultimatum dressed up as concern. I stood up, smoothed my cardigan, the blue one that Robert always said brought out my eyes, and I walked to my bedroom door. My hand rested on the doorknob for a moment while I took one final breath, centered myself, reminded myself that I was Margaret Eleanor Hartwell, not just David's mother, not just the elderly woman they'd been treating like an inconvenience. I opened the door and walked down the hallway toward the stairs. Each step was deliberate, purposeful, the walk of someone who knew exactly what she was walking into and had already decided how it would end. I could see them from the top of the stairs before they saw me. David and Vanessa, sitting on my sofa in my living room in my house, surrounded by papers and brochures, planning my future without me. The coffee table was covered in glossy publications, the kind with staged photographs of smiling elderly people engaged in activities they probably didn't choose. Sunrise Senior Living showed an old woman doing yoga in a group class. Golden Years Community featured a couple playing cards in a recreation room decorated in aggressively cheerful colors. Oakmont Retirement Village displayed a dining hall where residents ate at assigned times, at assigned tables, like school children. There were printouts too, what looked like pricing sheets and availability calendars and comparison charts. Vanessa had a notebook open, her handwriting visible even from the stairs, neat columns of pros and cons for different facilities. David was scrolling through something on his phone, occasionally showing the screen to Vanessa, both of them nodding seriously like adults making responsible decisions about a difficult problem. They hadn't heard me on the stairs. The old wooden steps that usually creaked under weight were silent, or maybe they were too absorbed in their planning to notice. I stood at the bottom of the staircase and watched them for several long seconds. These two people, who'd been living in my house for 3 years, eating my food, using my space, contributing nothing but criticism and entitlement. Vanessa was dressed in expensive athleisure wear, the kind that costs $200 and is designed for women who go to boutique fitness studios and post about wellness on social media. David wore the casual clothes he favored on his days off, jeans and a sweater I'd given him last Christmas, back when I still thought gift-giving might bridge the growing distance between us. They looked comfortable, settled, like they belonged there, and I was the intruder. I walked into the living room, my footsteps finally audible on the hardwood floor, and I asked the question I already knew the answer to. What are those? My voice cut through their conversation like a knife through fabric, sharp and clean. The effect was immediate and almost comical. David's head snapped up, his phone nearly slipping from his hands. Vanessa jumped slightly, her pen skittering across the notebook page, leaving an ink trail. Both of them froze, caught in the act, guilty expressions spreading across their faces like children discovered doing something forbidden. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was that clock on the mantel, still ticking, still marking time, indifferent to the tension suddenly filling the room like smoke. David recovered first, though his recovery was unconvincing at best. "Oh, Mom, hey, we didn't hear you come down." His voice had that forced, casual quality people use when they're trying to pretend everything is normal while knowing it absolutely isn't. He glanced at Vanessa, a quick look that said, "Help me, I don't know what to say." Vanessa, ever ready to take control, started gathering some of the brochures, actually attempted to slide them under a magazine on the coffee table like I was blind or stupid or both. But it was far too late for concealment. I'd seen everything. The nursing home brochures, the pricing sheets, the comparison charts, the notebook with her neat handwriting, evaluating facilities like she was shopping for a new car instead of planning to dispose of her husband's mother. I took 3 steps closer to the coffee table, my eyes fixed on the scattered evidence of their betrayal. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't need to. I simply asked again, each word precisely enunciated. "What are you looking at?" The question hung in the air, demanding an answer they clearly didn't want to give. David opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Vanessa again with panic in his eyes. He'd never been good at confrontation, had always avoided conflict growing up, had always needed someone else to be the enforcer, while he played the role of reasonable peacemaker. And Vanessa had apparently decided she was more than willing to be the bad guy if it meant getting what she wanted, which was my house without me in it. David tried to deflect, stumbling over his words like a teenager caught sneaking out past curfew. We were looking at some options, just researching. Nothing definite or anything. Just, planning ahead. Future planning, that kind of thing." His explanation was pathetic, transparent, insulting to my intelligence. Planning ahead for what? Exactly? For my death? For my decline? For the moment when he could justify shipping me off to institutional living and claiming his inheritance? I didn't respond to his weak attempt at deflection. I just kept looking at those brochures, at the photographs of strangers living in places that weren't their homes, surrounded by people who weren't their families, existing in a kind of pleasant prison designed to warehouse the elderly out of sight and out of mind. Vanessa, sensing that David's approach wasn't working, that I wasn't going to accept vague explanations and weak excuses, decided to take a different tack. She sat up straighter, arranged her features into an expression of mature concern, and spoke to me in that patronizing tone I'd come to hate over the past 3 years. "We need to talk about your future, Margaret. Not Mom, never Mom, always Margaret." Maintaining that distance that reminded everyone she wasn't actually my daughter and had no real obligation to me beyond what minimal courtesy she chose to extend. She gestured to the space on the sofa beside them, actually expected me to sit down like an obedient child called in to discuss a report card, like I was a participant in this decision, rather than the subject being decided upon without my input or consent. I didn't move from where I stood, didn't sit down, didn't make myself comfortable or compliant. I looked at Vanessa, then at David, then back at the brochures, and I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest where maternal warmth used to live. My future? I repeated her words back to her slowly, letting them echo in the room. In my house? I emphasized the possessive, made it clear that whatever they thought they were doing, whatever plans they thought they were making, they were doing it under my roof, in my property that I owned. Vanessa's expression flickered with irritation that I wasn't playing along, that I wasn't sitting down obediently to discuss the plans they'd made for me, like I should be grateful for their concern and intervention. She recovered quickly, though, pivoted to her backup strategy, the one where she pretended this was all for my benefit. "Margaret, We understand this is your house. Nobody's disputing that. But you have to be realistic. You're getting older, and with age comes risks. That plate you dropped this morning? That's exactly the kind of incident I'm talking about. What if you'd fallen? What if you'd been seriously hurt, and David and I weren't home? What if something happened, and nobody found you for hours? We have to think about these things practically. You need to think about these things. This isn't about us. This is about your safety, your well-being, your quality of life going forward. She delivered it all so smoothly, so reasonably, like she'd rehearsed the speech, which she probably had. The anger I'd been suppressing for 3 years, the hurt and frustration and sense of invisibility I'd endured while watching my house become their house and my life become an inconvenience, it all rose up in my throat, hot and fierce and demanding to be released. I dropped a plate because my hands were shaking, I said. My voice still calm, but with an edge now that made Vanessa's eyes narrow slightly. I was shaking because I'd just overheard my son discussing putting me in a nursing home like I was a problem to be solved instead of a person to be considered. I wasn't unsteady on my feet. I wasn't having some kind of medical episode. I was upset. There's a significant difference between those things, Vanessa, and the fact that you can't tell the difference is very telling. David looked at me then. Really looked at me, and I saw guilt flash across his face like lightning in a dark sky. He knew I'd heard them that morning in the hallway outside my bedroom. He knew I'd been standing on the other side of that door, listening to them discuss me like I was livestock to be relocated. He knew I'd heard every word about liability and lawsuits and the facility on Oakmont Drive and how much easier their lives would be without me. And instead of apologizing, instead of acknowledging that maybe they'd handled this in the cruelest possible way, instead of showing any remorse for the pain they'd caused, he got defensive. His guilt transformed into justification, his face hardening into the expression of someone who'd convinced themselves they were right, no matter what evidence suggested otherwise. Mom, listen, you're getting older. That's not an insult, it's just a fact. People age, bodies change, capabilities decline, and we can't be responsible for. He stopped mid-sentence, finally hearing what he was saying, finally recognizing how it sounded. But the damage was done. The words were out there, hanging in the air between us like poison gas. Can't be responsible. For me. For his mother. The woman who'd been responsible for him from the moment he took his first breath. Who'd been responsible for feeding him, clothing him, educating him, raising him alone after his father died. Who'd been responsible for every sacrifice that gave him the comfortable life he now enjoyed. That man was telling me he couldn't be responsible for me. The laugh that came out of my mouth surprised me as much as it surprised them. It was sharp, bitter, nothing like the gentle sounds I usually made around them to avoid causing discomfort or tension. It was the laugh of someone who'd just heard something so absurd, so hypocritical, so completely lacking in self-awareness that the only possible response was dark amusement. I crossed my arms and looked at my son. Really looked at him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Responsible? I repeated the word like it was foreign, like I was testing its meaning. You've been living here rent-free for 3 years, David. 3 years. In the house I own, the house I paid a mortgage on for 30 years, eating food I buy, using utilities I pay for. And you're telling me you can't be responsible? David's face flushed red, that immediate physical response he'd had since childhood when confronted with an uncomfortable truth he didn't want to acknowledge. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists at his sides. But before he could formulate a response, Vanessa jumped in, her voice rising with indignation that I dare point out the reality of their situation. We take care of you, Margaret. We cook, we clean, we make sure you're not alone in this big house. Do you have any idea how much we've sacrificed to be here? David could be making more money at a job in the city, but we stayed here for you. I've put my own career advancement on hold to be here for you. We've given up opportunities, social connections, our own independence, all to make sure you're not alone. And this is the thanks we get? Accusations and attitude? The audacity of her statement, the complete rewriting of reality happening right in front of me, it was almost impressive in its shamelessness. You cook? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. I made breakfast this morning that neither of you touched. I made dinner last night. I did laundry yesterday, including your clothes, Vanessa. I cleaned the bathroom you use. I vacuumed the living room. I bought the groceries currently in the refrigerator. I paid the electric bill, the water bill, the gas bill. So please, enlighten me. Tell me exactly what it is that you do? The question hung in the air, unanswerable, because the answer was nothing. They did nothing. They lived in my house, used my resources, occupied my space, and contributed absolutely nothing except their presence, which I was apparently supposed to be grateful for, simply because it meant I wasn't alone. The silence that followed was absolute and damning. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, unable to form words because there were no words that could refute what I'd said. David stared at the floor, at the coffee table, anywhere but at me, because looking at me would mean acknowledging the truth he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Neither of them could answer my question, because answering it would require admitting that everything they just said was a lie, that they weren't taking care of me, that they'd contributed nothing while taking everything, that their presence in my home was purely parasitic with no reciprocal benefit whatsoever. The truth was laid bare between us, impossible to deny, uncomfortable to acknowledge. Vanessa recovered first, and when she did, something shifted in her expression. The mask of the concerned daughter-in-law fell away completely, revealing something harder underneath, something calculating and cold that had probably been there all along, but hidden behind smiles and politeness and plausible deniability. She stood up from the sofa, and her voice when she spoke was different, sharper, done with pretense. This isn't about housework, Margaret. This is about the fact that you're old and getting older every single day, and eventually, sooner rather than later, you're going to need real care. Medical care, daily assistance, monitoring, someone to make sure you take your pills, don't fall in the shower, don't leave the stove on and burn the house down. And David and I have lives. We have careers and goals and plans for our future that don't include being full-time caretakers for an aging parent. She gestured at the brochures scattered across the coffee table like they were evidence supporting her argument. These facilities are designed specifically for this situation. They have trained staff, medical professionals on site 24 hours a day, activities and socialization opportunities, everything you need. You'd actually have a better quality of life than sitting here alone all day in this house with nothing to do and no one to talk to. This isn't cruelty, Margaret. This is planning. This is being realistic about what's coming and making smart decisions before there's a crisis. You should be thanking us for thinking ahead instead of fighting us on something that's inevitable anyway. She actually believed what she was saying, or at least she'd convinced herself she believed it. She'd rationalized abandonment as kindness, justified selfishness as practicality. David stood up too, and I watched him struggle with something internal, saw the last shreds of the good man he used to be fighting against what Vanessa had shaped him into, over 3 years of constant influence and manipulation. His face went through several expressions, guilt and anger and defensiveness all competing for dominance. When he finally spoke, I knew which side had won. Knew that the son I'd raised was truly gone, and this stranger had taken his place. Mom, just listen for a second. This isn't easy for anyone. It's not easy for us to have this conversation. But Vanessa has a point. You are getting older, and things are going to change whether you want them to or not. What happens in 5 years when you really can't take care of yourself? What happens in 10 years? We need to plan ahead, be proactive instead of reactive. He paused, searching for words. And then he said something that revealed everything, that showed me exactly where his priorities lay, that demonstrated with perfect clarity what this was really about. And honestly, Mom, this house, it's my inheritance. Dad would have wanted me to have it, to build my life here, to raise a family here eventually. And I can't do that if I'm constantly worried about you living here alone, about liability, about what happens when something goes wrong. I need to be able to plan my future. And your situation is preventing that. My inheritance. He'd actually said it out loud. Not our family home. Not the house you own. My inheritance. Like I was already dead. Like my continued existence was an obstacle to his plans. Like the house I'd paid for, lived in, maintained for 35 years, was his property being temporarily occupied by an inconvenient tenant who needed to be evicted. Your father is dead, I said quietly, and the words landed like stones in still water. David flinched like I'd slapped him. And this is still my house. My name is on the deed. My money paid the mortgage for 30 years while you were growing up. Every payment, every month, while working double shifts at the hospital to make sure we didn't lose it. Your father would be ashamed of you right now, would be disgusted and heartbroken by what you've become. Don't you dare invoke his memory to justify treating your mother like garbage. Don't you dare use the man who loved me more than anything in this world as an excuse for throwing me away like I'm worthless. Robert would never forgive you for this, David. And honestly, I don't know if I can either. Something shifted in David's expression then. Something fundamental and irreversible. The guilt that had been flickering there disappeared, replaced by anger, by resentment, by years of feelings I hadn't known existed, bubbling to the surface like toxic waste. Maybe Vanessa's constant commentary had finally worn him down completely. Maybe he'd been harboring these thoughts for longer than I knew, hiding them behind forced smiles and obligatory phone calls. Maybe the good son had always been an act, and this angry stranger was who he'd been all along. Whatever the reason, my son looked at me with something close to hatred in his eyes, and I knew we were past the point of no return, that whatever happened next would change everything permanently. You want to talk about Dad? Fine. Let's talk about Dad. David's voice was rising, his carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under pressure. He worked himself into an early grave, providing for this family, while you what? Played nurse and acted like you were some kind of hero? You think you sacrificed so much? He was the one who died at 56 from a heart attack, brought on by stress from working constantly to afford this house, this life, everything we had. And now you're sitting here acting like I owe you something? Like I'm supposed to be grateful? I'm tired, Mom. I'm so tired. Tired of waiting for you to do the right thing. Tired of walking on eggshells in what should be my own home. Tired of you making me feel guilty for wanting a life, for wanting what's rightfully mine. Each word was a knife, deliberately placed to cause maximum damage. This wasn't spontaneous anger. This was resentment that had been nurtured, fed, watered, grown into something monstrous under Vanessa's careful cultivation. These weren't new thoughts suddenly occurring to him. These were feelings he'd been sitting with for months, maybe years, poisoned against me by his wife's constant whispers and suggestions and reframing of our history. Vanessa stood beside him, her hand on his back, encouraging, supporting, pushing him toward the final explosion. Her expression was triumphant. This was what she'd wanted all along. This confrontation. This moment where David finally chose her version of reality over our actual history. She'd won, and she knew it. I could have pointed out that his father died from a genetic heart condition that ran in his family, not from stress. Could have reminded David that I worked just as many hours as Robert, that we were partners in building our life, that characterizing my career as playing nurse was insulting to the 28 years I spent helping people heal. Could have made him see how Vanessa had twisted his memories, poisoned his understanding of his own history, turned him against his mother with lies and manipulation. But I knew it wouldn't matter. He'd chosen to believe her narrative. He'd chosen resentment over gratitude, anger over love, his inheritance over his mother. There was nothing I could say that would penetrate the wall they'd built together. Nothing that would bring back the son I'd lost. I took a deep breath, centering myself, and spoke with a calmness that seemed to enrage him further. David, I understand you're upset, but this is still my house. I'm not going anywhere. I'm 68 years old, not 98. I'm healthy, independent, and perfectly capable of living in my own home for many more years. If you're unhappy with the living arrangement you chose 3 years ago, you're welcome to leave. Find your own place, build your own life. Pay your own rent and utilities and groceries, but you don't get to throw me out of my house. You don't get to claim my property as your inheritance while I'm still alive and living in it. That's not how this works, no matter what Vanessa has told you. That was the spark that ignited the explosion. My calm refusal, my boundary setting, my insistence on maintaining ownership of my own property and life, it was too much for David to tolerate. His face went from red to purple, a vein pulsing visibly in his temple. His entire body tensed like a coiled spring. Vanessa leaned close and whispered something in his ear, something I couldn't quite hear but could easily guess. Something like, "You have to stand firm. She'll never leave on her own. This is your house. Make her understand." And David, fully under her control now, fully committed to the path she'd laid out for him, did exactly what she wanted. He stood to his full height, towering over where I stood, and for the first time in my life, I felt physically intimidated by my own child. His voice when it came was a shout that echoed through the house, through the rooms where I'd raised him with love and patience, through the walls that held decades of memories now being incinerated by his rage. "If you don't want to go to a nursing home, then pack your bags and get out of my house." The words reverberated in the air like the aftermath of an explosion. Out of my house. Not our house. Not your house. My house. He'd claimed it. Claimed ownership of my property, my home, my life, and ordered me to leave like I was an unwelcome stranger, like I was nothing, like I'd never meant anything. My son had just thrown me out, actually screamed at me to pack my belongings and leave the house I owned. Silence fell over the living room, heavy and oppressive and absolute. Even Vanessa looked slightly shocked by the intensity of David's outburst, though the small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth told me she was pleased with the result. She'd pushed him to this moment, had been steering him toward it for 3 years, and now that it had happened, she was experiencing the satisfaction of a plan successfully executed. David stood there breathing hard, his chest heaving like he'd run a marathon, his hands still clenched into fists, his face still purple with rage and adrenaline. He didn't take it back, didn't apologize, didn't seem to register the enormity of what he'd just done, what line he'd just crossed, what relationship he'd just destroyed, beyond any possibility of repair. I looked at him, really looked at him. Studied his face like I was trying to memorize it, like I was searching for some trace of the child I'd raised in this angry stranger's features. I looked for the little boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, who was afraid of thunderstorms and slept with a nightlight until he was 9. I looked for the teenager who cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart, who called me from college homesick and lonely. I looked for the young man who thanked me at his wedding for every sacrifice I'd made. I looked for my son, and I saw nothing. Nothing familiar, nothing recognizable, just a stranger wearing David's face, corrupted by entitlement and poisoned by Vanessa's influence into someone I didn't know, someone I wasn't sure I'd ever known. And I saw a stranger. Someone I'd never met before despite sharing 42 years of history. Maybe the David I thought I knew had never existed. Maybe I'd projected qualities onto my son that were never really there, loved an illusion while this person, this angry entitled man, had been lurking underneath all along. Or maybe Vanessa had successfully destroyed everything good in him, corrupted him so thoroughly that the man he used to be was gone forever. Either way, the result was the same. I was looking at a stranger who happened to have my late husband's eyes and my nose and my DNA, but none of my values, none of my compassion, none of my capacity for love and loyalty. The son I'd raised was dead, and this stranger had taken his place. "All right," I said. Just one word. Calm, quiet, definitive. "All right." David blinked, his anger faltering, replaced by confusion. That clearly wasn't the response he'd expected. Vanessa's satisfied smile wavered. They'd anticipated crying, pleading, begging, the kind of maternal guilt and emotional manipulation that would let them position themselves as the firm adults standing strong against an unreasonable old woman's dramatics. But I wasn't giving them that. I wasn't protesting or resisting. I was agreeing. I was accepting his order to leave, and my calm acceptance unsettled them more than any amount of tears could have. It wasn't the script they'd written in their heads. It didn't fit the narrative where they were responsible adults and I was the difficult problem. David's mouth opened, some of his anger draining away, replaced by uncertainty and maybe the first flicker of regret. "Mom, he started, his voice losing some of its rage, sounding almost like himself again for a brief second. But I held up my hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No, you've made yourself very clear, David. This is your house. You want me gone, so I'll leave. I won't fight you. I won't make this difficult. I'll pack my things and I'll go. You can have your house, your space, your future, everything you want without me in the way." I turned toward the stairs, toward my bedroom, toward the suitcase I would pack, and the phone call I'd already made, and the limousine that would arrive in less than an hour. I didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing any emotion on my face. And that's when I smiled. Not in front of them. They didn't see it. But walking up those stairs, feeling the weight of my son's words settling over me like a shroud, I smiled, because in that moment, I realized something profound, something liberating, something that changed my perspective on everything that had just happened. I'd been afraid of losing my son. That fear had controlled me for 3 years. That fear had kept me quiet when I should have spoken up, had made me accept unacceptable treatment, had convinced me to make myself small and invisible to avoid conflict. I'd been terrified that if I pushed back, if I set boundaries, if I demanded respect, I would lose David forever. That fear had been the chain keeping me locked in my own prison. But standing there listening to the echo of his words, "Pack your bags and get out of my house," I understood with perfect clarity that I'd already lost him. Years ago, maybe when Vanessa entered his life and started poisoning him against me. Maybe long before that, when he left for college and started building a life where I was just background noise. Maybe I'd never really had him the way I thought I did. The son I loved, the son I'd sacrificed everything for, the son I'd built my entire life around, he was gone. Maybe he'd never existed outside my own hopes and dreams. Either way, mourning that loss while trying to hold on to someone who wasn't there anymore was pointless. I'd been grieving someone who was already dead, while he stood in front of me wearing my son's face. What I was about to gain, though, that was something else entirely. Something these two people standing in my living room couldn't begin to comprehend because they knew nothing about who I really was. They knew Margaret the mother, Margaret the widow, Margaret the retired nurse who lived modestly in a middle-class house. They didn't know Margaret Eleanor Hartwell, the woman I'd been before marriage and motherhood. They didn't know about the life I'd walked away from, the connections I'd maintained in secret, the resources at my disposal that I'd never mentioned. They didn't know who had answered the phone that morning when I made that call. They didn't know who was sitting in that limousine that would arrive in exactly 43 minutes. They didn't know anything. And they were about to find out. I went to my bedroom. The room looked exactly as I'd left it hours earlier, untouched, unchanged, the bed made with military precision, the curtains open, everything in its place. I opened my closet and looked at the 3 suitcases stored on the top shelf. 3 matching pieces of luggage. Navy blue Samsonite, purchased 20 years ago for a European vacation, Robert and I never took, because he died 2 weeks before we were scheduled to leave. Those suitcases had sat unused for 2 decades, waiting for a journey that never happened. Until now. I pulled down one suitcase, just one, because where I was going, everything would be provided. Clothes, accommodations, respect, dignity. All the things that had been stripped from me in this house would be waiting for me elsewhere. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, this story is for you. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or treated like you don't matter by the people who should love you most, you need to stay until the end of this. Drop a comment right now and let me know where you're watching from, because I want to know who's part of this community, who understands what it feels like to be discarded by your own child. And subscribe to this channel right now, because if you don't, you're going to miss what happens next. You're going to miss the moment David opens that door and sees who's in the limousine. You're going to miss his face when he realizes who his mother really is. You're going to miss the truth about Margaret's past, about the phone call, about everything. And trust me, you don't want to miss that. Subscribe now, because what happens next will change everything. To understand what happened next, to comprehend why a limousine was about to pull up to my modest suburban house, to make sense of the expression that was about to appear on my son's face, you need to know who I was before I became just mom. Before I became the invisible elderly woman my son wanted to discard. Before I became Margaret Hartwell, widow and retired nurse, living quietly in a house nobody thought much about. You need to know who Margaret Eleanor Bristol was, because that woman, the one I'd been before marriage and motherhood and grief, reshaped me into someone quieter and smaller. She never really disappeared. She just went underground, stayed silent, waited. And that morning, when I made that phone call, I woke her up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. Back to when I was young and hungry and ambitious in ways my son never knew about. I was born Margaret Eleanor Bristol in 1955 in a small town in Pennsylvania called Millbrook, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and nobody ever left, because leaving meant admitting you wanted more than what generations of your family had settled for. My father, Thomas Bristol, worked at the steel mill, same as his father before him, same as every man in our neighborhood. He'd leave before dawn and come home after dark, his hands permanently stained with grease and metal dust, his body aging faster than it should from the physical toll of manual labor. My mother, Eleanor, for whom I was named, was a seamstress who took in work from the wealthier families on the other side of town. She'd sit at her sewing machine in our tiny living room, her fingers moving with precision and speed, creating beautiful clothes for other people's children, while her own daughter wore hand-me-downs and homemade dresses constructed from leftover fabric. We weren't poor, not exactly, but we lived paycheck to paycheck in a 3-room house with thin walls and windows that let in cold air during Pennsylvania winters. My parents worked constantly, sacrificed everything, dreamed of giving me opportunities they never had. My mother used to tell me that education was the only way out, that my brain was my ticket to a different life. She'd check my homework every night even though she'd only completed 8th grade herself, couldn't help with the actual problems, but made sure I was doing the work. My father would sit at our small kitchen table after dinner and listen to me read aloud from whatever book I'd borrowed from the library, nodding with pride even when he was too exhausted to keep his eyes open. They believed in me in a way that was both beautiful and suffocating, their hopes for my future resting on my shoulders like a weight I couldn't put down. I was a brilliant student, not to brag, but simply stating fact. I graduated valedictorian from Millbrook High School with perfect grades in every subject, test scores that shocked my teachers, recommendations that called me exceptional and once in a generation. I applied to colleges I'd only read about in magazines, schools that seemed as distant and unreachable as the moon. And then the letters started arriving. Acceptances, scholarship offers, full rides to universities where people like me, working-class kids from nowhere towns, didn't usually go. I chose one in upstate New York, far enough from home to feel like freedom, but close enough that I could visit if needed. Business administration. That was my major. Because I was practical even then, because I knew that passion didn't pay bills, but business skills opened doors. My parents cried the day I left, pride and fear mixing together as they watched their only child board a bus heading toward a life they couldn't fully imagine. I was the first person in my family to go to college, the first Bristol to sit in a lecture hall, to live in a dormitory, to use words like networking and portfolio and strategic planning. I loved it immediately, every single aspect of it. The classes that challenged me, the professors who treated me like an intellectual equal, the library where I could study until midnight without anyone telling me to turn off the light and save electricity. I was hungry for knowledge, for experiences, for the future I'd dreamed about in that small house in Millbrook. I worked part-time in the campus bookstore to cover expenses. My scholarship didn't. Studied harder than anyone else because I knew I had more to prove. Made plans for the successful career I would build after graduation. But I never finished. Because during the second semester of my freshman year, I met someone who changed everything. Someone who altered the entire trajectory of my life in ways I couldn't have predicted. His name was Robert Hartwell. I met him in 1975 in a political science class I was taking as an elective. He sat 3 rows behind me, but I felt him watching from the first day, felt his eyes on me in a way that made me self-conscious and flattered simultaneously. After the third lecture, he approached me in the hallway, introduced himself with a confidence I found both attractive and slightly irritating. Robert was charming in that effortless way some people are, like charisma was something he'd been born with rather than developed. He was tall, handsome in a classic way with dark hair and blue eyes, always dressed better than the other students, in clothes that looked expensive because they were. He came from money, real money, the kind I'd only ever seen in movies. His family owned oil wells in Texas, had investments in real estate and stocks and businesses I didn't fully understand. We started dating within a week of that first conversation, and it was intense from the beginning, the kind of young love that feels all-consuming and inevitable. Robert was ambitious, talking constantly about the business empire he would build, the mark he would make on the world separate from his family's legacy. He wanted to prove himself, to be more than just a trust fund kid coasting on inherited wealth. I loved that about him, that drive, that refusal to simply accept the easy path laid out before him. We'd stay up late talking about our futures, making plans, dreaming together. He wanted to start his own company. I wanted to climb the corporate ladder, break glass ceilings, become the kind of woman who commanded boardrooms. We were going to conquer the world together, young and stupid and convinced that love and ambition were all we needed. But his family didn't approve of me. Didn't approve is actually too mild a phrase. They hated the idea of me. When Robert brought me home for Thanksgiving of my freshman year, to their estate in Houston that was bigger than my entire neighborhood in Millbrook, the reception was ice cold. His mother, Catherine Hartwell, looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd discovered on the bottom of her shoe. His father, Robert Sr., asked pointed questions about my background, my family, my prospects, each question designed to highlight how unsuitable I was. His sister ignored me completely. Over a dinner that cost more than my father earned in a month, they made it perfectly clear that I was beneath them, beneath their standards, beneath their son. Robert defended me, got into a shouting match with his father that ended with us leaving early. But the damage was done. I'd seen how his family viewed me, poor, common, a gold digger trying to trap their precious son. I got pregnant at 19, spring semester of my sophomore year. We'd been careful most of the time, but not careful enough, and one mistake was all it took. I found out in April, took 3 different pregnancy tests in the bathroom of my dorm, cried alone because I couldn't tell anyone, couldn't process what this meant for my future. All those plans, the career I'd mapped out, the life I was building, it all came crashing down around a positive pregnancy test. I told Robert a week later, terrified he'd run, that he'd choose his family and their money over me and this unplanned child. But he didn't. He proposed immediately. Went out and bought a ring the same day. Told me we'd get married and figure everything else out together. His family was furious. Threatened to disown him if he went through with it. Told him I'd trapped him, that I'd gotten pregnant on purpose to secure access to their money. They offered me a substantial sum to disappear, to handle the situation quietly, and leave Robert alone to live the life they'd planned for him. Robert married me anyway. We had a small ceremony at City Hall. Just us and 2 witnesses. We pulled off the street. No family present, because mine couldn't afford the travel, and his refused to attend. And his family made good on their threat. They cut him off completely. No more tuition payments. No more allowance. No more trust fund access. No more inheritance. Nothing. He was disowned, written out of the will, treated like he'd died. He chose me over millions. Literally millions of dollars, oil money and investments, and real estate holdings that would have set him up for life. His family had the kind of wealth where generations never have to work, where money makes money indefinitely. And he walked away from all of it for me, for us, for the baby we were about to have. I've never forgotten that sacrifice, never stopped being grateful for it. It's why his death 15 years ago devastated me so completely. It's why David's behavior now feels like such a betrayal of everything his father stood for. We moved into a tiny apartment in a cheap part of town and started building a life from nothing. Robert dropped out of college, couldn't afford tuition anymore, and found work in construction. Manual labor, the kind of physical work he'd never done before. Coming home exhausted and sore with calluses on his hands that had only ever held pens and tennis rackets. But he never complained, never blamed me, never seemed to regret his choice, even when things were hard. I dropped out too, couldn't manage classes while pregnant and working, couldn't afford childcare for after the baby came. I found secretarial work, typing and filing and answering phones for a small accounting firm that paid barely above minimum wage. We struggled financially in ways that would have been unimaginable if Robert had stayed in his family's good graces, but we were happy, genuinely happy. We had each other, had love, had hope that things would get better, but the baby I was pregnant with, the reason we'd married so young and upended our lives, I lost at 6 months. A stillbirth, the doctors called it. Clinical language for the most devastating experience of my young life. I went into labor knowing my baby was already gone. Delivered a son who never took a breath, held him for a few minutes before they took him away. We named him Thomas, after my father, and buried him in a cemetery we couldn't really afford plots in. That loss nearly destroyed me, sent me into a depression so deep I couldn't see daylight. Robert held me through it, took care of me, never once suggested that maybe we'd made a mistake, that maybe we should have taken his family's money and avoided all this pain. He just loved me through the worst period of my life. We tried for years after that to have another child. Years of hoping and disappointment, of pregnancy tests and doctor visits and procedures and prayers. I had 3 more miscarriages, each one taking a piece of my heart, each one making me wonder if I was being punished for something, if I'd somehow failed at the most basic biological function. Robert never wavered, never blamed me, never suggested we give up. And then, in 1982, 7 years after we'd lost Thomas, David was born. Healthy, screaming, perfect. The miracle baby we'd almost given up hope for. I held him in the hospital and sobbed with relief and joy and gratitude. He was everything we'd wanted, everything we'd waited for. Robert cried too, kissed my forehead, told me we'd finally gotten our happy ending. By the time David was born, our financial situation had stabilized somewhat. Robert had worked his way up to foreman in construction, was earning decent money. I'd gone back to school, night classes while pregnant, determined to finish what I'd started, even if it took longer than originally planned. I got my business degree when David was 2 years old, walked across that stage with my toddler in the audience, and my husband cheering louder than anyone. Robert was so proud of me, so supportive, took on extra childcare duties so I could study, never complained about the sacrifices required. He believed in me, in my intelligence, in my potential, even when I'd stopped believing in myself. That degree opened doors. I got a better job, then a better one after that, eventually ending up in hospital administration before transitioning to nursing later. What Robert didn't know was that I was using my business degree for something he never expected, something I kept secret for 20 years until his death, and then kept secret for 15 more years after that. Something that connected me to people in places Robert couldn't imagine, that gave me resources and power and influence I never spoke about because it wasn't relevant to our daily life. That secret was about to become very relevant. That secret was sitting in the back of a limousine, heading toward my house. That secret was the reason my son's world was about to be turned completely upside down. But before I tell you what that secret was, you need to understand what happened next, in that bedroom, as I finished packing my single suitcase and waited for everything to change. In 1987, I did something women didn't talk about doing, especially women married to men who prided themselves on being providers. I started a business, my own business, without telling my husband, without asking permission or discussing it or making it a joint decision. I just did it. Quietly, secretly, building something that was entirely mine in a life where everything else was shared or sacrificed or given away. It started small, almost accidentally, in a way that didn't feel like starting a business at all, but rather like solving a problem I'd noticed that nobody else seemed to see. I was working in hospital administration at the time, and part of my job involved coordinating with families when elderly patients were being moved to nursing facilities or had passed away. These families were overwhelmed, grief-stricken, dealing with decades of accumulated possessions they had no idea what to do with. I noticed a pattern. These families would hold estate sales, desperate to empty houses quickly so they could sell the properties or terminate leases. They'd price everything to move fast, had no idea of actual value, just wanted it gone. And I'd watch valuable items, genuine antiques, collectibles, art, furniture. I'd watch it all sell for pennies on the dollar to dealers who knew exactly what they were buying and exactly how much profit they'd make reselling it. It bothered me, this exploitation of grief and ignorance. These families were being taken advantage of during their most vulnerable moments. And then I had a thought. What if someone ethical did this? What if someone helped these families understand what they had, got them fair prices, and made a reasonable profit doing it? What if that someone was me? I started small with money I'd saved from my own paychecks, maybe $500 total. I'd attend estate sales early, before the dealers arrived, with a small book I'd borrowed from the library about antiques and collectibles. I'd look for items I recognized as undervalued, things priced at $5 or $10 that I knew were worth $50 or $100. I'd buy them, take them home, clean them up, and resell them through classified ads and small antique shops that worked on consignment. The first item I ever flipped was a Depression-era glass bowl priced at $3 that I sold for $75. The second was a set of vintage fountain pens I got for $20 and sold for $200. Within 3 months, I'd turned that initial $500 into $3,000. Within 6 months, I had $10,000. I was good at this. Really good. I registered a business under my maiden name, M.E. Bristol and Associates. Associates was optimistic since it was just me, but it sounded more professional, more established. I got a separate post office box for business correspondence. I opened a business bank account at a different bank than where Robert and I kept our joint accounts. I kept meticulous records, tracked every purchase and sale, operated completely above board from a legal and tax perspective, but completely underground from a personal one. Robert had no idea. David, who was 5 years old at the time, certainly had no idea. Nobody knew that while I was working my regular job and being a wife and mother, I was also building something entirely my own, creating a safety net, establishing independence in the only way I knew how. I didn't tell Robert because I didn't want him to feel like I didn't trust him to provide for us, like his construction work and the life we'd built together wasn't enough. He was so proud, had already sacrificed so much by walking away from his family's money, had worked so hard to give us a stable life. Telling him I was secretly building a business felt like saying I didn't believe in him, didn't trust that he could take care of us, needed a backup plan in case he failed. But the truth, the real truth I barely admitted to myself, was that I was terrified of being dependent, terrified of being trapped. I'd watched my mother completely reliant on my father, watched her have to ask permission for money to buy groceries, watched her have no choices because she had no resources of her own. I'd dropped out of college, had babies, had put my career on hold, had done all the things women were expected to do. And I loved Robert, loved our life, but I needed something that was mine. Some security that didn't depend on anyone else. The business grew quietly over the years, expanding in ways I hadn't initially anticipated. I developed a reputation, built relationships with antique dealers and auction houses and collectors. People started coming to me directly, asking me to evaluate estates, to handle entire liquidations rather than just cherry-picking individual items. I had an eye for valuable things, could spot quality and authenticity in ways that came naturally, like a skill I'd been born with but never had the opportunity to use. I specialized in estate liquidations, would contract with families to handle everything from assessment to sale to distribution of proceeds. I was fair, honest, got people good prices, and took a reasonable commission. Word spread through estate lawyers and hospitals and funeral homes. By the time David was in middle school, I had more business than I could handle alone. By 1995, I was making 6 figures annually from the business, more than double what I earned at my regular job. All of that money went into separate accounts and investments that Robert knew nothing about. I worked with a financial advisor I'd found through business connections, someone who had no connection to our personal life. We built a diversified portfolio, conservative but smart, designed for long-term growth. I bought bonds and index funds and some individual stocks in companies I researched carefully. I reinvested profits, lived modestly off my regular salary, and watched my secret accounts grow year after year. David never knew. How could he? He was a child, then a teenager, then a young man focused on his own life. He saw his mom who worked at the hospital and came to his soccer games and helped with homework. He had no idea about M.E., Bristol and Associates. I struggled with the secret, wrestled with guilt about keeping something so significant from Robert. There were moments when I almost told him, times when the weight of the deception felt too heavy to carry alone. After particularly good years, when I'd made substantial profits, I'd rehearse conversations in my head about how to explain what I'd been doing. But I never had those conversations, never found the right words or the right moment. Part of me was afraid he'd be hurt, feel betrayed, question why I didn't trust him. Part of me was afraid he'd want to use the money, make investments or purchases that would deplete the security I'd built. And part of me, the part I'm least proud of, wanted to keep this one thing entirely mine, untouched and separate from our shared life. Robert died suddenly in 2009. A heart attack at age 56 while at work, massive and fatal, gone before the ambulance arrived. I got the call at the hospital where I was working, rushed to the emergency room of a different hospital where they'd taken him, arrived to find doctors shaking their heads with sympathy and regret. He was already gone. I didn't get to say goodbye, didn't get to tell him I loved him one more time, didn't get any of the closure people hope for when losing someone. He was just there one morning, kissing me goodbye before leaving for work, and then he was gone forever. The grief was overwhelming, suffocating, made worse by the guilt that my last secret from him would now remain a secret forever. I'd never get the chance to tell him about the business, about the money, about the life I'd built in the shadows of our marriage. We'd lived modestly our entire marriage, Robert and I. We owned our house but had a small mortgage remaining. We had some savings, maybe $20,000 in our joint accounts. Robert had a small life insurance policy through his work, $50,000 that barely covered funeral expenses and immediate bills. To the outside world, to David, who was 27 at the time and living across the country, it looked like I'd been left in difficult financial circumstances. A widow with a mortgage and a modest income, facing retirement age with inadequate savings. David offered to help financially, wanted to send money, and I told him no, told him I'd be fine, that his father and I had prepared for this possibility, which was technically true, just not in the way David understood. At Robert's funeral, I almost told David the truth. Almost sat him down and explained that despite appearances, we were going to be okay. That his mother had resources he didn't know about. I could see the worry on his face, the calculations he was making about how to support me, the guilt that he lived far away and couldn't be there daily. I wanted to relieve that burden, tell him not to worry. But something stopped me. A mother's instinct, that inexplicable feeling that warns you when something isn't right, even if you can't articulate what or why. I looked at my son, grieving his father, making promises about how he'd take care of me, and something inside me said, wait, don't tell him yet. Keep this to yourself a little longer. So I did. I let him believe I was struggling financially. Let him think his mother was just getting by on a pension and Social Security. Let him assume I needed protecting and supporting in ways that weren't actually true. That instinct, that decision to keep my secret, even after Robert's death, that would save me 15 years later when my son stood in my living room and screamed at me to get out of his house. Because that $400,000 I had in investments and accounts when Robert died, the money I'd accumulated over 22 years of running M.E., Bristol and Associates, the nest egg nobody knew existed. By the time my son threw me out, it had grown to something much, much more. I'd continued the business after Robert's death, expanded it actually, had more time to devote to it after retiring from the hospital. I'd made smart investments during the market recovery after 2008. I'd been patient, strategic, careful, and that $400,000 had multiplied in ways that would have shocked anyone who knew me as just Margaret, the widow, the retired nurse, the elderly mother, living in a modest house. But they were about to find out exactly who I really was. When Robert died, David was 27 years old, grown, independent, married to his first wife, Sarah, living his own life in a different city, with a career and plans and a future that seemed bright and stable. I thought I'd raised him right, thought I'd instilled values that would last a lifetime. Respect for elders, gratitude for sacrifice, loyalty to family, the importance of character over material wealth. Those were the lessons I tried to teach, the principles Robert and I had modeled throughout his childhood. I thought they'd taken root, thought my son was a good man who would carry those values forward. I was wrong. Not immediately wrong, but eventually, definitively wrong in ways that would break my heart. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me tell you about David before he became the stranger who threw me out. David married young, at 23, to a woman named Sarah Chen who he'd met in college. She was kind, intelligent, worked as an elementary school teacher, came from a good family who welcomed David warmly. I liked her immediately, saw in her someone who genuinely loved my son, who brought out the best in him. Their wedding was modest but beautiful, and watching David stand at that altar, looking at Sarah like she was his entire world, I thought about Robert looking at me the same way decades earlier. I thought about legacy, about my son building the kind of marriage his father and I had, based on love and partnership and mutual respect. They seemed happy in those early years, genuinely content with each other and the life they were building together. David had a good job in sales at a pharmaceutical company, was making decent money and moving up in the organization. They rented an apartment at first, saved aggressively, talked about buying a house and starting a family. In 2012, they found a small starter home they loved but couldn't quite afford the down payment for. David called me, embarrassed to ask, but asking anyway, wondering if I could help them. I said yes immediately. I gave them $40,000, told him it was from Robert's life insurance, money I'd been saving for exactly this kind of situation. It wasn't a loan. It was a gift, from a mother who wanted to see her son settled and secure. David cried when I transferred the money, told me he'd never forget it, promised he'd take care of me when I got older, the same way I was taking care of him now. Those words would echo in my mind years later with bitter irony. We were close during those years, David and I. He'd call every Sunday without fail. They'd visit for holidays and long weekends. Sarah would help me in the kitchen, while David watched football with the television volume too loud. We'd play board games and take walks, and have the kind of easy, comfortable family time I'd dreamed about when he was growing up. I watched my son be a good husband, attentive and loving, the kind of partner Sarah deserved. They tried for children, wanted a big family, but struggled with fertility issues that brought them heartbreak month after month. I supported them through the disappointment, held Sarah while she cried after another negative pregnancy test, reminded David that their worth as a couple wasn't measured by their ability to have children. They seemed to weather it together, their bond strengthening rather than breaking under the pressure. The divorce came in 2015, sudden and shocking to everyone who knew them. David called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice flat and empty, and told me it was over. He and Sarah were separating. I asked why. What happened? Begged him to reconsider, to try counseling, to not give up on a marriage that had seemed so solid. He wouldn't give me details, just said they'd grown apart, wanted different things, that it was mutual and amicable. But when the divorce was finalized 3 months later, I learned the truth from Sarah herself. She called me crying, told me David had changed over the past year, become obsessed with money and status, started resenting their modest lifestyle, blamed her for the fertility issues, accused her of wasting his best years. She said she didn't recognize him anymore, that the man she'd married had disappeared and been replaced by someone angry and entitled and cruel. I didn't want to believe her, made excuses in my mind. He's hurt. He's processing disappointment. He's going through something. Everyone handles grief differently, and the loss of the future they'd planned had to be devastating. I called David, tried to talk to him about what Sarah had said, suggested maybe he needed therapy to work through his feelings. He got angry with me, told me to stay out of his marriage, said Sarah was manipulating me and I was choosing her over my own son. I backed off, gave him space, hoped time would heal whatever was broken inside him. But David didn't get better after the divorce. He got worse. The bitterness calcified into something permanent. He started making comments about money, about what he deserved, about how he'd sacrificed his youth and had nothing to show for it. Parents do that, don't we? We see our children's flaws clearly, see them exhibiting behaviors we know are wrong, and we explain them away because accepting the truth is too painful. He's hurt. He's stressed. He's going through a difficult transition. He'll get better once he heals. We convince ourselves that the ugliness is temporary, situational, that underneath the anger and entitlement is still the child we raised with good values and a kind heart. We never want to believe that maybe, just maybe, we raised someone capable of cruelty, that maybe the flaws aren't temporary reactions to hardship but permanent features of their character, that maybe we failed in some fundamental way, or maybe they made choices independent of our teaching, or maybe people are just more complicated than we want them to be. I made excuses for David for years, unable to accept what was becoming increasingly obvious. David met Vanessa in 2018 at a real estate investment seminar he'd started attending. She was different from Sarah in every possible way. Polished, status-conscious, always dressed in expensive clothes with perfect hair and perfect nails. She was 10 years younger than David, 31 to his 41, worked in commercial real estate for a development company, drove a luxury car she couldn't actually afford. She talked constantly about networking and personal branding and leveraging relationships. Everything was transactional with Vanessa. Everyone was either useful or irrelevant. I disliked her immediately. Felt it in my gut the first time David brought her to my house for dinner. Something was wrong with her, or wrong with them together, or wrong with the way David changed when she was around, becoming more arrogant and dismissive. They married within 6 months of meeting, a rushed courthouse wedding, followed by an expensive reception paid for by Vanessa's parents. David didn't ask my opinion about the speed of their relationship, didn't seem to care what I thought, barely involved me in the wedding planning. When I did try to express concern, tried to gently suggest maybe they should take more time to really know each other, his response cut deep. "Don't be jealous, Mom. Just because you're alone doesn't mean I should be." Like my concern for his well-being was actually selfish loneliness. Like I couldn't want what was best for him without it being about me. That was the first time my son had been deliberately cruel to me, and I should have recognized it as a warning sign of everything that was coming. But I told myself he was defensive, that new love made people irrational, that he'd apologize once the honeymoon phase wore off. He never did. The first 2 years of their marriage, I barely saw them. They lived an hour away and were always too busy to visit. Too many work commitments, social obligations, things that took priority over spending time with David's elderly mother. When they did come for obligatory holiday visits, Vanessa would spend the entire time on her phone or making comments about my house, my cooking, my life. "This neighborhood has really gone downhill, hasn't it, Margaret? You should really think about updating your kitchen. These appliances are ancient. Don't you get lonely in this big house all by yourself?" Each comment felt like a probe, testing, searching for weakness. David would sit silently during these observations, never defending me, never telling his wife to show respect. I'd watch him choose her comfort over my dignity again and again, and I'd feel the distance between us growing wider. Then 2021 arrived, and with it the pandemic that changed everything. David lost his job, part of massive layoffs in his industry. Vanessa's real estate work slowed to almost nothing as deals fell through and clients disappeared. They burned through their savings quickly, had been living beyond their means for years, suddenly found themselves unable to afford their rent. David called me in March, his voice small and embarrassed in a way that reminded me of the boy he used to be. "Mom, I need to ask you something. We're in a tough spot financially. Just temporary. Just until the economy recovers and I find something new. Could we maybe stay with you? Just for a few months? 6 at most? I'll get back on my feet and we'll be gone before you know it." What was I supposed to say? This was my son asking for help, my only child, struggling, needing his mother. Of course I said yes. Of course I told him they could stay as long as they needed. I had the space, had the secret money that could support all of us comfortably, even if they contributed nothing. I was lonely in that house, had been lonely for 12 years since Robert died, and having family around, even difficult family, felt better than the silence. I cleaned out the guest bedroom, bought new sheets and towels, prepared a welcome dinner for their first night. I told myself this could be good, a chance to build a better relationship with Vanessa, to reconnect with David, to be useful and needed instead of alone and forgotten. Temporary became a year. A year became 2 years. 2 years became 3. David found a new job after 8 months, but never mentioned moving out. Vanessa went back to work, but started buying expensive clothes and getting salon treatments instead of saving for their own place. The conversation about when they'd leave just stopped happening, like the temporary arrangement had silently transformed into something permanent that nobody acknowledged out loud. And slowly, gradually, my house stopped being mine. Vanessa began redecorating, making changes without asking permission. She replaced my living room curtains with modern ones I hated. She moved my furniture around. She brought in her own artwork and took down my family photos. She reorganized my kitchen, my closets, my entire home, according to her preferences. I felt like a guest in my own house, tiptoeing around their schedules and preferences, apologizing for existing in spaces I'd owned for 35 years. David barely looked at me most days, treating me like part of the furniture rather than his mother. Vanessa acted like she was doing me a favor by being there, like her presence was charity rather than parasitism. They'd have friends over and introduce me awkwardly if I happened to walk through. "Oh, this is David's mom, she lives here too." Like I was the guest. Like it was their house that they'd graciously allowed me to occupy. I should have said something, should have established boundaries, should have reminded them whose name was on the deed. But I was lonely. And having my son close, even if he barely looked at me, even if he treated me like an inconvenience, it felt better than the alternative. Until it didn't. Until the morning I overheard them planning to put me in a nursing home. Until David screamed at me to pack my bags and get out. Until everything changed. The explosion didn't happen in a day. It wasn't spontaneous combustion, but rather a slow burn that took 3 months of small deaths, little moments where I disappeared piece by piece until there was almost nothing left of me in my own home. Looking back now, I can trace the path clearly, see exactly how we got from uncomfortable coexistence to David screaming at me to get out. It started in June of 2024 and escalated through July and August until it reached its inevitable conclusion in September. 3 months of being erased, dismissed, treated like an inconvenience that needed to be managed. 3 months of watching my son become someone I didn't recognize while his wife orchestrated my removal with calculated precision. If I'd kept better track, if I'd been paying closer attention instead of making excuses, maybe I would have seen it coming. But grief and loneliness make you blind to things you don't want to see. June 12th was my birthday. 68 years old, a date I'd been celebrating in this house for 35 years. Robert used to make a big deal of my birthday, would take the day off work, and plan something special, even during the years when we had no money and special meant a picnic in the park with homemade sandwiches. After he died, David had continued the tradition for a while. He'd call first thing in the morning, send flowers, take me to dinner. Even after his divorce from Sarah, even during his angry, bitter phase, he'd still acknowledged my birthday. But this year was different. I woke up that morning hoping, expecting someone to remember. I came downstairs to find David and Vanessa eating breakfast, neither of them saying anything. I waited for them to wish me happy birthday, drop some hint that they had plans. Nothing. Just Vanessa complaining about her coffee being too weak and David scrolling through his phone, ignoring both of us. I finally said something around noon, casually mentioned that it was my birthday, watched their faces for recognition or guilt or any response at all. Vanessa looked up from her laptop with vague surprise. "Oh, is it today? Happy birthday, Margaret." Then immediately back to her screen, like she'd discharged an obligation. David muttered something similar. Didn't even make eye contact. Didn't apologize for forgetting. That evening, they got dressed up nicely. I thought maybe they'd been pretending to forget, that this was all leading to a surprise. But when I asked if we were going somewhere, Vanessa explained they had dinner reservations. Just the two of them. Date night. They left at 6 and didn't come home until after 10. I spent my 68th birthday eating a frozen dinner alone in my kitchen, trying not to cry, trying not to admit how much it hurt to be so completely forgotten by my only child. Later that week, I walked past the guest bedroom they were using and saw them with paint swatches spread across the bed, holding different colors up to the wall, discussing which shade of gray would work best. I asked what they were planning. Vanessa answered without hesitation. "We're thinking of redecorating this room. It's so dated, so grandmotherly. Something more modern would really brighten the space. This room. My guest bedroom in my house, the room they were temporary guests in, they were planning to repaint without asking me. And the way she said it, so grandmotherly, like that was an insult, like my taste and my choices in my own home were problems that needed correcting. David said nothing, just kept comparing paint samples like this was completely normal. I stood in that doorway feeling invisible, unnecessary, already gone. That night, I looked at myself in the mirror in my bathroom, really looked at my reflection for the first time in months. 68 years old with gray hair I'd stopped coloring. Lines around my eyes and mouth that mapped decades of living. Hands that showed my age in ways I couldn't hide. When had I become so small? Not physically small, but existentially diminished, taking up less and less space in the world, in my own home, in my son's awareness. I'd spent my whole life being necessary, being needed, being someone who mattered. And somewhere along the way, I'd become invisible, a ghost haunting my own house, irrelevant and in the way. I touched my reflection in that mirror and whispered to myself, this has to stop. I didn't know what that meant yet, didn't have a plan, but something inside me had reached a limit. July brought more of the same, but worse, the dismissals becoming more frequent and obvious. I'd overhear conversations they didn't know I could hear or didn't care if I heard. Vanessa on the phone with a friend, her voice carrying from the living room to where I was in the kitchen. It's exhausting, honestly. It's like having a tenant who doesn't pay rent. Just there all the time. Always around, always in the way. Can't wait for a drink without worrying about what she thinks. Can't have friends over without her hovering. I stood at the sink frozen, hands in soapy dishwater, listening to my daughter-in-law describe me like I was an infestation in her home. The home that was mine. The house she lived in for free while complaining about my presence in it. I should have confronted her, walked in there and reminded her whose house this was. But I didn't. I just stood there feeling small again. David wasn't much better. I heard him talking to Vanessa late one night when they thought I was asleep, his voice floating up through the heating vents into my bedroom. She won't be around forever. Another 5 years, maybe 10 at most. We just have to be patient. We can deal with anything for a few more years if it means getting the house. Talking about my death like it was a timeline they were working with, a deadline for an inheritance they were already counting on. Your mother? Vanessa corrected him. Your mother won't be around forever. Like she was reminding him I was a person, his parent, not just an obstacle between them and property. But David just agreed, didn't defend me, didn't express any sadness at the idea of losing me. Just patience. Just waiting for me to die so they could claim what they'd decided was theirs. I discovered they were telling friends the house was theirs. Not that they were staying with me, not that they were living in my house temporarily, but that this was their house, their property, where they lived. A friend of mine from the hospital mentioned it to me at the grocery store. I ran into Yu's son and his wife at the mall. They invited me to dinner at their beautiful home. Your house is lovely, Margaret. I must have looked confused because she clarified. Well? David said it was their house. I assumed you'd moved or sold it to them. I explained they were staying with me, that the house was still mine. She looked embarrassed, apologized for the confusion, hurried away. I stood in the cereal aisle, feeling like I'd been erased, like my existence in my own home had been written out of the story they were telling the world. I started keeping a journal in mid-July. Nothing fancy, just a spiral notebook I kept in my nightstand drawer. I'd write down every comment, every slight, every incident that made me feel dismissed or disrespected. July 15th, Vanessa threw away leftovers I'd specifically said I wanted for lunch. July 18th, David told someone on the phone he had the house to himself when I was literally sitting in the next room. July 22nd, found them measuring my bedroom for furniture. I didn't know why I was documenting everything, didn't have a plan for what I'd do with this record. But something was telling me to keep track, to create evidence, to make sure I had proof that I wasn't imagining things, that this was really happening. The journal filled up quickly, too quickly. August was when everything accelerated toward the inevitable confrontation. The warning signs went from subtle to blatant, from passive dismissal to active hostility. Vanessa started leaving things out where I'd find them. A nursing home brochure on the kitchen counter, open to the pricing page. A printout about memory care facilities left on the coffee table. An article about the benefits of assisted living for seniors, conveniently placed next to where I sat for my morning coffee. She'd claimed they were accidents, just things she'd been researching for a friend's parent, nothing to do with me. But the message was clear. We're planning your exit. We're researching where to put you. Your time in this house is running out. David stopped including me in conversations entirely. If I walked into a room where he was talking to Vanessa, he'd stop mid-sentence and wait for me to leave. If I asked about their plans for the day, I'd get vague non-answers or irritated responses about why I needed to know their business. We started eating meals at completely different times. They'd have dinner at 7, wouldn't tell me, wouldn't save any for me. I'd come down at 8 to find dirty dishes in the sink and no food left. When I mentioned it, Vanessa said they'd assumed I'd already eaten, that they couldn't be expected to track my schedule. I started eating alone in my bedroom, keeping granola bars and fruit in my nightstand like I was hiding food in my own kitchen. My mail started disappearing. I'd be expecting bills, bank statements, correspondence from my financial advisor for M.E. Bristol and Associates. Things that should have arrived weren't arriving. At first, I thought it was postal service issues. Then one day in late August, I found my trash can in the garage had been used, even though I knew I'd emptied it the day before. I opened it and found my mail. Opened mail. My bank statements, my investment account summaries, my business correspondence, all opened and read and thrown away like junk mail. Someone had gone through my financial information, seen my account balances, discovered I had significantly more money than they'd assumed. That's when I knew this wasn't just about wanting me gone. They were trying to figure out if I had money. Money they thought should be theirs. I confronted David about the mail that evening. He denied it at first, claimed he had no idea what I was talking about. Then when I showed him the open statements with his fingerprints literally on them, he got defensive. I was just checking to make sure you weren't being scammed. Elderly people are targets for financial fraud. I was protecting you. But his eyes told a different story. He'd seen the numbers in those accounts, seen that his mother had resources he'd never known about. And instead of asking me about it, instead of being happy I was financially secure, he was angry. Angry that I'd had money while he was struggling. Angry that I hadn't told him. Angry that his inheritance was going to be larger than he'd thought, but I was still alive to control it. That's when I knew we were past the point of reconciliation. That's when I started preparing for what I knew was coming. What they didn't know was that I'd just received a letter. It arrived in early August, sent to my P.O. box that I used for business correspondence, the box they didn't know existed. The return address was from a law firm in Texas, Houston specifically. The letter inside was from someone I never thought I'd hear from again after 35 years of silence. Robert's sister, Catherine Hartwell Morrison. The sister who'd ignored me at Thanksgiving in 1975, who'd refused to attend our wedding, who'd cut her brother off completely when he chose me over family money. She'd found me after all these years, and she had an offer that would change everything. But that's a story for the next part. First, you need to see what happened when David finally exploded, when the 3 months of buildup reached its breaking point, when everything I'd been documenting in that journal became evidence of exactly who my son had become. It arrived on September 1st, 2024, exactly 2 weeks before the confrontation that would change everything. I remember walking to my post office box that morning, the same box I'd maintained for decades for M.E. Bristol and Associates, the box David and Vanessa knew nothing about. Most days, the mail was routine, business correspondence, invoices, contracts, nothing particularly interesting. But that day, there was a cream-colored envelope mixed in with the regular mail. Expensive paper, the kind with weight and texture that announced importance before you even opened it. The return address was embossed in elegant script. Hartwell Family Trust, Boston, Massachusetts. My hands started shaking the moment I saw that name. Hartwell, Robert's family. The family that had disowned him 49 years ago. The family that had pretended he was dead rather than acknowledge his marriage to me. I stood in that post office holding the envelope, afraid to open it, unable to understand why, after decades of silence, they would contact me now. I didn't open it there. I drove home, waited until David and Vanessa left for work, then sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and stared at that envelope for 20 minutes before finding the courage to break the seal. To understand why this letter mattered so much, why my hands were shaking, why my heart was racing, you need to know about Robert's family, the Hartwells of Boston. Old money, the kind that goes back generations, built on shipping and railroads and investments that multiplied over centuries. Theodore Hartwell, Robert's father, inherited a fortune and grew it larger through real estate and strategic business acquisitions. Catherine Hartwell, Robert's mother, came from similar wealth. Two powerful families merging through marriage the way wealthy families do. They had 2 sons, James, the eldest, groomed from birth to take over the family business, and Robert, the spare, expected to support his brother and maintain the family reputation. Robert had told me stories about growing up in that world. Private schools where tuition cost more than most people earned in a year. Summers at the family compound on Martha's Vineyard. Expectations about who you'd marry, what career you'd pursue, how you'd present yourself to society. Everything was about appearances, about maintaining status, about preserving wealth and power across generations. Robert had been expected to marry someone appropriate, someone from their social class with the right connections and pedigree, someone who would enhance the Hartwell name rather than tarnish it. Instead, he'd fallen in love with me. Margaret Eleanor Bristol, from Millbrook, Pennsylvania, daughter of a steelworker and a seamstress. Scholarship student with no money, no connections, no value to offer the Hartwell family, except that their son loved me and I loved him. When Robert brought me home for Thanksgiving in 1975, the reception was glacial. Theodore looked at me like I was something unpleasant he'd discovered on his shoe. Catherine asked pointed questions designed to highlight my inadequacy, my unsuitability, my complete lack of belonging in their world. And James, Robert's older brother, who was 30 at the time compared to Robert's 20, James had been particularly cruel. I remember him cornering me in the hallway while everyone else was in the dining room. He told me I was embarrassing myself, that I clearly didn't belong, that Robert was slumming and would eventually come to his senses. He offered me money to leave quietly, to disappear before I caused more damage to the family reputation. I told him to go to hell, which in retrospect probably wasn't the diplomatic response, but I was 19 and angry and in love. When I got pregnant and Robert proposed, his family didn't just disapprove, they went to war. Theodore threatened to disown Robert completely if he married me. Catherine begged him to reconsider, to at least wait until after graduation, to think about his future. James told Robert he was throwing his life away for a girl who trapped him with a pregnancy, accused me of getting pregnant deliberately to secure access to family money. They offered me increasingly large sums to have an abortion and leave. When none of it worked, when Robert married me anyway at City Hall with no family present, they followed through on their threats, disowned him completely, cut off all financial support, removed him from the family trust, changed their wills to exclude him entirely, told everyone in their social circle that Robert had made his choice and was no longer considered part of the Hartwell family. Theodore Hartwell died in 1995, 20 years after disowning his son, and remained bitter until the end. Robert tried to reconcile before his father's death, wrote letters that went unanswered, made phone calls that were refused, attempted to bridge the gap that had existed for 2 decades. Theodore died without ever speaking to Robert again, without ever meeting his grandson David, without ever softening his position that Robert's marriage to me was an unforgivable betrayal of family expectations. Robert grieved that loss deeply, not the loss of money, but the loss of relationship, the permanent severing of a father-son bond that could never be repaired. He'd always hoped for reconciliation, always believed that eventually time would heal the rift. His father's death ended that hope forever. Catherine lived longer, survived her husband by 13 years, died in 2008 at 85 years old. I went to her funeral even though I knew I wasn't welcome, even though I hadn't been invited, even though showing up was probably a terrible idea. Robert had been dead less than a year. I was still deep in grief, still trying to figure out how to live without him, and I thought maybe his mother would want to know about him, would want to hear that he'd lived a good life despite being cut off from family wealth, that he'd been happy, that he'd been a wonderful father and husband, that he'd died knowing he was loved. I stood in the back of the church during the service, wearing black, trying to be invisible, but James saw me. Robert's brother, 63 years old by then, running the family business empire, spotted me in the back row. He didn't make a scene during the service. He waited until afterward, until people were filing out, and then he approached with 2 security guards. He told me I wasn't welcome, that I had no right to be there, that my presence was disrespectful to his mother's memory. He had the security guards escort me out of the church, physically walked me to my car, while mourners watched and whispered. I tried to tell him about Robert, about his brother's life and death, tried to share something, anything, some connection between the brothers who'd been estranged for 33 years. But James wouldn't listen. He just repeated that I needed to leave, that the Hartwells wanted nothing to do with me, that I should never contact the family again. I drove home humiliated and heartbroken, grieving not just for Robert, but for the family that had rejected us so completely. And now, 16 years after that funeral, 24 years after Robert's death, there was a letter from James Hartwell sitting on my kitchen table. I opened it with shaking hands, unfolded expensive stationery with the Hartwell family crest embossed at the top. The handwriting was shaky, the writing of someone elderly or ill. It started formally, but the formality broke down quickly into something more personal, more raw. Dear Margaret, you don't know me, though we met once, briefly, at my brother's wedding that I refused to attend, and again at my mother's funeral where I had you removed like you were a criminal. I was cruel both times. I've been cruel for 50 years. I'm dying now, pancreatic cancer, stage 4, months left, rather than years. And I find I have regrets. So many regrets. Chief among them is how my family treated Robert. How I treated Robert. He was my brother, and I chose money and status over that relationship. I've lived with that choice for decades. I can't change it now. But perhaps I can do something. The letter continued for 3 pages, James's handwriting getting shakier as it went on, like the physical act of writing was difficult. He explained that after his mother's funeral, after having me escorted out, he'd felt guilty. Not enough to reach out, not enough to apologize, but enough to be curious. He'd hired a private investigator to find out what had happened to me, to learn about Robert's life that he'd missed by cutting his brother off. The investigator had compiled a comprehensive report. James knew everything. Knew that Robert had worked in construction until his death. Knew about David, the grandson he'd never met. Knew about my nursing career. Knew about M.E., Bristol and Associates, my secret business that had flourished quietly for decades. Knew about my financial situation, my assets, my current living arrangement with David and Vanessa. He'd been watching me for 16 years, without ever making contact, gathering information, observing from a distance like I was a specimen under glass. The letter's tone shifted in the final page, became more urgent. Margaret, I need to meet you. I have things to tell you about Robert, about our family, about arrangements I've made. I've watched you build a life from nothing after my family took everything from Robert. I've watched you raise your son alone after Robert died. And I've watched your son treat you with increasing disrespect over the past 3 years. I know more than you realize. I have resources and information that belong to you, that should have belonged to Robert. I can't undo 50 years of cruelty, but I can try to make amends in the time I have left. Please call me. The letter included a private phone number. A cell phone, he answered himself. Not a secretary or assistant. Please, Margaret, let me try to do one decent thing before I die. Your brother-in-law, James? I put that letter in my nightstand drawer and didn't call. Didn't respond. Sat with it for a week, trying to decide what to do. What could James Hartwell possibly offer me that I'd want after all these years? Money? I had money? Apologies? Apologies? 50 years too late didn't heal anything. Relationship? I didn't want a relationship with the man who'd had me escorted out of his mother's funeral. I was angry reading that letter. Angry that he thought he could observe me without my knowledge for 16 years. Angry that he'd hired someone to investigate my life. Angry that he assumed I needed or wanted anything from the Hartwell family. Robert had walked away from them, had chosen a life without their money or approval, and we'd been fine. Better than fine. We'd been happy. What could James offer that would be worth reopening that old wound? But I kept the letter, took it out, and reread it several times. The part about David particularly bothered me. James knew about the past 3 years, knew how David had been treating me. How? How extensive was this investigation? What exactly did James know about my current situation? The questions nagged at me, competed with my anger and pride, made me curious despite my better judgment. Then the week before the confrontation with David, before everything exploded, I had a dream. A vivid dream where Robert was sitting in our kitchen, young and healthy like he'd been when we first married. He was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper like he used to do on Sunday mornings. I walked in, and he looked up and smiled. "Call my brother," he said. "Just call him." I tried to argue, tried to explain all the reasons why that was a bad idea. Robert just kept smiling. "Trust me. Call James." I woke up with tears on my face. I made the call that morning, September 7th, 2024, 7 days before David would scream at me to pack my bags. I dialed the number from the letter with shaking hands, half hoping it would go to voicemail so I could hang up and forget about this. But James answered on the second ring. His voice was rough, weakened by illness, but still recognizable as similar to Robert's. "Margaret," he said before I'd even identified myself. "Thank you for calling." I almost hung up then, unnerved that he'd known it was me. But something kept me on the line. We talked for 47 minutes. What James told me during that conversation changed everything. But not in the way you think, not in the obvious way. He didn't offer me money or property or anything material. What he offered was information. Information about Robert's life before he met me. Information about the Hartwell Family Trust. Information about provisions that had been made decades ago that nobody had told me about. And information about what he'd observed over 16 years of having me investigated, including detailed knowledge about David and Vanessa's plans for me that was more extensive than what I'd overheard myself. After my son screamed at me, after he told me to pack my bags and get out of his house, after I looked at him and saw a complete stranger wearing my child's face, I walked up those stairs one last time. My legs felt steady beneath me. My hands didn't shake. My breathing was calm and even, because I knew something he didn't. Something that would change everything in exactly 53 minutes when a limousine pulled up outside. I climbed each step with deliberate precision, my hand trailing along the banister that Robert had installed himself 30 years ago, my feet finding the spots on the stairs that didn't creak from decades of knowing this house intimately. I could feel David and Vanessa watching me from the living room, probably wondering why I wasn't crying or begging or putting up any fight at all. Let them wonder. They'd understand soon enough, I reached the top of the stairs and heard their voices drift up from below. They weren't even trying to be quiet, weren't bothering with pretense now that they'd finally said what they'd been thinking for months. David's voice carried clearly, filled with relief and something that sounded almost like joy. "Finally! God, I thought she'd never leave. I thought we'd be stuck with her forever." "Did you see her face?" She actually looked shocked, like she didn't see this coming. Vanessa's laugh followed, that high-pitched sound I'd learned to hate over 3 years of living with her. "I know. And did you see how fast she agreed? Didn't even fight. That's how you know she knew deep down she didn't belong here anymore. This room." She was talking about my bedroom now, the room I could hear them approaching. "This room will make a perfect office. Big windows, lots of light. We can put your desk here and my workspace there. Finally have a proper home office." I stood in the hallway outside my bedroom door, listening to them plan the dismantling of my life, the redistribution of my space, the erasure of my existence in the house I'd lived in for 35 years. They were in my room now. I could hear their footsteps on the carpet, could hear Vanessa opening my closet, probably already mentally clearing it out. We'll need to get rid of all her stuff, obviously. Donate most of it. Though we should check pockets and drawers first, make sure there's nothing valuable. Old people sometimes hide money in weird places. David agreed readily. No hesitation, no sentiment about going through his mother's belongings. "Yeah, and we need to repaint. This wallpaper is ancient, whole room needs updating." They were redecorating my bedroom before I'd even left the house, dividing up my possessions like I was already dead. I pushed open my bedroom door and they both jumped, startled by my presence in my own room. Vanessa had the audacity to look annoyed that I'd interrupted their planning. David at least had the decency to look slightly embarrassed, though not enough to apologize or take back anything he'd said. I didn't speak to them. Didn't acknowledge their presence, just walked to my closet, pulled down that single suitcase, and placed it on my bed. They watched me for a moment. Then Vanessa whispered something to David and they left. Went back downstairs, probably to continue planning my bedroom conversion somewhere I wouldn't overhear. Though clearly they didn't care if I overheard. The cruelty was the point now. They wanted me to know I wasn't wanted, wasn't valued, wasn't going to be missed. I looked around that room. Really looked at it like I was seeing it for the first time, or the last time, or both. The room I'd shared with Robert for 24 years until his death. The wallpaper we'd hung together in 1992. A soft floral pattern that was probably dated now, but that I loved because we'd chosen it together. The bed where we'd slept and talked and made love and made plans. The rocking chair in the corner where I'd rocked baby David through countless sleepless nights, singing lullabies until he'd finally drift off. The dresser where I'd kept Robert's things for 2 years after his death because I couldn't bear to remove them. The window where I'd stood so many mornings watching the sunrise, drinking coffee, thinking about the day ahead. This room held 45 years of memories, of life lived, of love and loss and everything in between. And I felt nothing. The room was already gone, already belonged to the past, already converted in my mind from my sanctuary to just another space I used to occupy. The emotional attachment I should have felt, the grief at leaving, the nostalgia for all those memories, none of it came. The room was empty of meaning because David, the person those memories centered around, was already lost to me. Loving a room because I'd rocked my son there made no sense when that son had just thrown me out. Cherishing the space I'd shared with Robert felt wrong when his own child was dishonoring everything Robert had stood for. I looked at that room and saw furniture and walls and floors. Nothing more. It was already gone. I was already gone. Now I just needed to physically leave. I opened my suitcase and began to pack with careful deliberation. Not everything, not even most things. Just what mattered, just what connected me to who I'd been before this house became a prison. I started with photographs, but only specific ones. The picture of Robert on our wedding day at City Hall, young and happy and choosing me over millions. The picture of my parents at my college graduation, proud and hopeful. The picture of Robert and me on our 20th anniversary, taken just 2 years before he died, both of us older but still clearly in love. I deliberately left behind every photograph that included David. Baby pictures, childhood photos, teenage years, college graduation, his first wedding, all of it stayed on the dresser. If he wanted them, he could keep them. If he threw them away, that would tell me everything I needed to know. But I wasn't taking memories of a son who no longer existed. I packed my mother's jewelry, the few pieces she'd owned that had been passed down to me when she died. A simple gold locket, a pair of pearl earrings, a bracelet my father had saved for months to buy her for their 25th anniversary. Nothing expensive, nothing valuable to anyone but me, but irreplaceable because of what they represented. My parents had believed in me, had sacrificed so I could have opportunities they never had loved me unconditionally right up until they died. That jewelry was a connection to people who'd valued me, who'd never made me feel like a burden. I wrapped each piece carefully and placed them in a small jewelry case that went into the suitcase. I gathered my important documents, the papers David and Vanessa had no idea existed. My business licenses for M.E. Bristol and Associates, my investment account statements, my property deeds, yes, plural, because the modest house we were standing in wasn't the only real estate I owned. Bank account information, passwords, and access codes. Contact information for my financial advisor, my lawyer, my accountant, all the evidence of the life I'd built secretly, the resources I'd accumulated, the security I'd created. I'd kept physical copies of everything in a locked file box in the back of my closet behind old shoes. I transferred it all to my suitcase. If David went through my room after I left, he'd find nothing. No information about my finances. No clues about who I really was. Just an old woman's modest possessions. I chose one dress from my closet. Just one, though I owned dozens. A blue dress with a full skirt, vintage style, carefully preserved for 49 years. The dress I'd worn on my first date with Robert in 1975, the night he'd taken me to an Italian restaurant near campus, and we'd talked for 4 hours straight. I'd kept that dress through decades and multiple moves and changing fashion trends because it represented the beginning of everything. The night I'd met the man I'd love for the rest of my life. The moment before his family rejected me, before we struggled, before everything got complicated. That dress was innocence and hope and the belief that love could conquer anything. I'd never worn it again after that first date, kept it wrapped in tissue paper like a museum piece. Now I folded it carefully and placed it in my suitcase. I left behind every gift David had given me in recent years. A scarf from 3 Christmases ago, still in its box. A gift card to a restaurant I'd never used. A generic card from my last birthday before this one. A coffee table book about gardens that he'd clearly grabbed at random. All of it impersonal, thoughtless, the kind of gifts you give to someone you feel obligated to acknowledge but don't actually care about. They could stay here, could be thrown out or donated or kept. I didn't care. They meant nothing because they'd been given without thought or love. The only gifts I kept were from when David was young. A handmade card from 2nd grade, a clay pot he'd made in art class. Things created when he still loved me. Those went in the suitcase, the rest could rot. 30 minutes had passed since David's explosion. 30 minutes of packing and sorting and deciding what version of my life I'd carry forward. I sat on the edge of my bed and pulled out my phone. The private number James Hartwell had given me was already in my contacts, saved under a name David wouldn't recognize. I dialed. James answered on the first ring, his voice weak but alert. "Margaret?" I took a breath. "I'm ready. Can you send the car?" There was a pause, the sound of James breathing, labored and difficult. "Are you sure? This is a big decision. Once you leave, things will change. You understand that?" I looked around my bedroom one more time, heard Vanessa laugh at something downstairs, remembered David's face twisted with rage. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. "Send the car." James's relief was audible. "It'll be there in 1 hour. I've sent my personal driver, a man named Thomas, who's worked for our family for 30 years. He'll take care of everything. Just be ready. And Margaret, there's something else you should know. Something I didn't tell you during our first conversation. When you get in that car, when you see who's with me, your son is going to recognize them. This is going to be very public, very quickly. Once you leave with me, there's no going back to the life you had." "I understand," I told him. And I did. I understood that I was burning bridges, making choices that couldn't be unmade, stepping into a future I couldn't fully predict. And I was choosing it anyway. "The car will be there in 1 hour," James repeated. "I'll see you soon, sister-in-law." The line went dead. I sat on my bed, with my packed suitcase by the door, waiting. Downstairs, I could hear David and Vanessa moving around, their voices carrying up occasionally. The sound of a tape measure extending, that distinctive metallic zip. They were measuring rooms, planning renovations, treating my house like it was already theirs, deciding which walls to paint, which furniture to remove, how to modify my home to suit their preferences. They thought they'd won, thought they'd successfully removed the obstacle between them and the life they wanted. They had no idea what was coming, no idea who was sitting in the back of a limousine heading toward this house right now, no idea what David was about to lose. One tear fell. Just one, sliding down my cheek and dropping onto my hands folded in my lap. Not for my son, not for this house, not for the life I was leaving, but for Robert. For the man who'd sacrificed everything for me, who'd walked away from wealth and family to choose love, who'd worked himself to exhaustion to provide for us, who'd died too young without ever reconciling with the brother who'd rejected him. Robert would have been heartbroken by what David had become, would have been devastated to see his son treat his mother with such cruelty, would have been ashamed and furious and broken. That grief, Robert's grief that he never had to experience because he died before seeing this, that's what the tear was for. I wiped it away. Just one. That was all I'd allow. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I remembered who I was before I was David's mother, before I was Robert's wife, before I was Margaret Hartwell, the widow, the retiree, the elderly woman taking up space in her own home. I was Margaret Eleanor Bristol, the first person in my family to go to college, the daughter of a steelworker who'd believed education was the only way out, the scholarship student who'd competed with wealthy classmates and excelled, the woman who'd built a business from nothing while working full-time and raising a child, the woman who'd survived loss and betrayal and loneliness, the woman who'd accumulated wealth quietly while everyone underestimated her. That woman had never been weak, had never been a victim, had never needed anyone's permission to exist or thrive or claim what was hers. I'd forgotten her somewhere along the way, buried her under years of being accommodating and quiet and small. But she was still there, still strong, still capable, and she would survive this too. At exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, I heard it. The sound of an engine approaching from down the street, getting closer, different from the usual neighborhood sounds of minivans and sedans. This was something else entirely. The low, powerful purr of serious money, the kind of engine that announces itself without being loud, that commands attention through quality rather than volume. A Rolls-Royce. I stood up from where I'd been sitting on my bed and walked to the window, pulled back the curtain just enough to see the street below. And there it was, turning onto my block, moving slowly like it had all the time in the world. A black Rolls-Royce limousine, the kind you see in movies about billionaires or dignitaries, gleaming in the afternoon sunlight like it had been polished minutes before. The kind of vehicle that doesn't belong in middle-class suburban neighborhoods where people mow their own lawns and park their cars in driveways instead of garages. I watched it glide to a stop directly in front of my house, precise and deliberate, taking up space at the curb like it owned the street. The engine went silent, but the presence remained. This massive vehicle that screamed wealth and power and importance sitting in front of my modest 3-bedroom ranch. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, and even from my second-floor window, I could see he was professional in every detail. Full chauffeur's uniform. Not the cheap rental kind, but real livery, tailored and pressed. White gloves, cap. Dignified bearing. The kind that comes from years of service to people who expect perfection. He was older, maybe 65. Moved with careful precision as he walked around to the passenger side of the vehicle. This was Thomas, the man James had mentioned, who'd worked for the Hartwell family for 30 years. He looked exactly like what he was, old money's trusted employee. I glanced down the street and saw curtains twitching in windows. Mrs. Peterson from 3 houses down was standing on her porch, pretending to water plants while staring at the limousine. The Johnsons across the street had come to their front window, both of them visible behind the glass. Mr. Chen next door was in his driveway, had stopped washing his car to watch. A Rolls-Royce in our neighborhood was an event, something to witness and discuss and speculate about. Who was it for? Why was it here? The attention made me smile slightly. David and Vanessa wanted to erase me, make me invisible, but I was about to become the most visible person on this entire block. The most talked about, the most speculated about, and they had no idea it was coming. I could hear David and Vanessa still in the back of the house, their voices carrying from what used to be Robert's study. They hadn't noticed the car yet, too absorbed in their planning and measuring and reimagining my home without me in it. I picked up my suitcase, took one final look around the bedroom that had been mine for 35 years, and walked out without looking back. My footsteps were steady on the stairs, each step deliberate and certain. This was happening. I was leaving. And in approximately 2 minutes, David was going to understand exactly what he'd done, exactly who he'd thrown out, exactly what he was losing. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood in the foyer, my suitcase at my feet, waiting. David must have heard my footsteps or sensed movement because he came out from the back room, Vanessa right behind him. He saw me standing there with my suitcase, and his expression shifted to something that looked almost like satisfaction, "Oh, you're actually leaving." He said it like he'd half expected me to change my mind, to beg to stay, to back down from my agreement to go. "Where are you gonna go, Mom? A motel? You got enough money for that?" The smirk on his face was ugly, condescending, the look of someone who thought they'd won completely. Vanessa stood behind him with her arms crossed, watching me like I was entertainment, like my departure was the successful conclusion to a campaign she'd been running for 3 years. Neither of them had any idea what was parked outside. Neither of them could imagine what was about to happen. I didn't answer David's question, didn't dignify it with a response. Just stood there, holding my suitcase, calm and composed, waiting for the inevitable. And then it came. The doorbell, a simple sound that would change everything. David looked at me, confused about who would be at the door, then walked past me to answer it. He pulled the door open with casual confidence, probably expecting a delivery driver or neighbor, and froze. The chauffeur stood on my porch, imposing despite his age, professional and formal, in a way that immediately communicated this wasn't a casual visit. The man spoke with perfect diction, addressing me over David's shoulder. "Mrs. Hartwell, your car is ready." 5 words that contained multitudes. Your car, not a taxi, not a rideshare. Your car, possessive, implying ownership or at least arrangement, implying expectation and preparation. David's head swiveled between the chauffeur and me, his brain trying to process what was happening. "Car? What car?" His voice had lost its smirk, replaced by confusion and the first hint of uncertainty. He looked past the chauffeur, his eyes finding the limousine at the curb, and his mouth actually fell open. "What is this? Mom, what's going on?" He was asking me questions now, not making statements, not smirking, actually seeking information he didn't have. The power dynamic had shifted in seconds. Vanessa pushed past him to see what he was looking at, and her reaction was even more pronounced. "Is that a limo?" She said it like the word itself was foreign, like she couldn't reconcile the presence of a Rolls-Royce limousine with the elderly woman she'd been dismissing and disrespecting for 3 years. Her eyes went wide, her confident posture faltering. This wasn't in their script. This wasn't how my departure was supposed to look. I wish you could have seen David's face in that moment. The confusion spreading across his features like ink in water. The beginning of fear creeping in around the edges as he started to realize this wasn't random, wasn't a mistake, wasn't something he understood or controlled. He thought this had to be an error, that I'd called the wrong number or been scammed by someone pretending to offer services I couldn't afford. That somehow his elderly mother, who he'd assumed had no resources and no options, couldn't possibly have arranged for a Rolls-Royce limousine to pick her up. His worldview, his assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of, they were all cracking but hadn't shattered yet. That was coming. In about 30 seconds, his entire understanding of reality was about to be demolished. The back door of the limousine opened, not the chauffeur opening it, but from the inside, someone choosing to step out rather than waiting. A man emerged, unfolding himself from the back seat with the careful movements of someone elderly but still dignified. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that probably cost more than David's car. Everything about him screamed wealth, old wealth, the kind that's so embedded it doesn't need to announce itself. He stood beside the limousine for a moment, looking at the house, looking at David in the doorway, then began walking up the front path toward us. His steps were slow but steady, the walk of someone who'd spent his entire life having doors opened for him, having people wait for him, commanding space and attention simply by existing. This was James Hartwell, my brother-in-law, the man who'd had me thrown out of his mother's funeral, the man who'd been watching me for 16 years, the man who was about to change my life. David stared at this stranger approaching, and I could see him trying to place the face, trying to figure out why this man looked vaguely familiar. "Who is that?" He asked the question to me, to Vanessa, to the air, to anyone who might answer. I spoke for the first time since agreeing to leave, my voice calm and clear and carrying across the porch. "Your uncle, your father's brother." The words landed like bombs. David's face went white, actually drained of color in a way I'd only seen once before, when he'd gotten news that Sarah wanted a divorce. "But you said," he started, his voice weak, his eyes going back and forth between James and me. "You said his family wanted nothing to do with us. You said they cut Dad off. You said we'd never hear from them. All of that was true. All of it had been accurate for 49 years. I looked at my son and gave him the simplest truth. They didn't want anything to do with us. Things change." James reached the porch, climbed the 3 steps with effort but determination, and stood directly in front of me. He ignored David completely, didn't acknowledge his existence, kept his eyes fixed on me. Up close, I could see Robert in his features. The same bone structure, the same eye color, the resemblance between brothers who hadn't seen each other in decades. But where Robert had been warm, James looked reserved. Where Robert had been open, James was guarded. The illness showed in his face, the weight loss and pallor that came with cancer, but his dignity remained intact. He extended his hand to me, a formal gesture that somehow felt intimate. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough but sincere, "it's time to come home. Home. Not to return to your house or to leave this place or any neutral phrasing. Home. Like there was a place waiting for me, a place that belonged to me, a place I was expected and wanted." The word hung in the air between us. David finally found his voice, pushed past his shock enough to speak. "Wait. Wait." The panic was clear now, the realization that something was happening that he didn't understand and couldn't control. "Mom, what is happening? Where are you going? Who is this really?" His questions tumbled over each other, desperate, the confident son who'd thrown me out, replaced by someone frightened and confused. Vanessa grabbed his arm, whispered something I couldn't hear, probably asking the same questions. I looked at David, really looked at him, saw the boy I'd raised somewhere under the fear and confusion and entitlement, and felt nothing. No urge to explain, no desire to make him feel better, no maternal instinct to protect him from discomfort. He'd made his choice when he screamed at me to get out. Now he'd live with the consequences of that choice. I turned back to James and nodded. "I'm ready." What David didn't know, what I hadn't told him because he'd never asked about his father's family, what he couldn't have imagined because I'd kept it secret, was that home wasn't a house, wasn't an apartment or condo or modest property somewhere. Home was an estate, a 12-bedroom estate on Boston Harbor that had been in the Hartwell family for 4 generations. The property included the main house, a guest house, a pool house, 6 acres of landscaped grounds, a private dock, and views of the harbor that were worth millions just for the location. The estate was currently valued at $47 million. And as of that morning, following a legal transaction that had been prepared over the past week since my first phone call with James, the estate was mine. James had transferred ownership to me, his sister-in-law, the woman his family had rejected for nearly 50 years, his way of making amends, his deathbed attempt at justice for how they treated Robert, my inheritance, my home, mine. If you're still watching this, I need you to do something right now. Drop a comment and tell me if you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew everything about you. Tell me if you've ever had the satisfaction of proving someone completely wrong about who you are and what you're capable of. Because what I'm about to tell you next, about what I inherited and what my son lost, about the moment David finally understood what he'd thrown away, about what happened when I walked out that door toward a life he never knew existed, you're not going to believe it. But every word is true. Stay with me. We're almost at the end, and the ending is worth every second you've invested in this story. Let me take you back 2 weeks. To September 7th, 2024. To that 47-minute phone call with James Hartwell that changed everything. I was sitting in my bedroom with the door closed, holding my phone with shaking hands, listening to a man I'd met twice in my life, both times unpleasantly, tell me things that were rewriting my entire understanding of the past 35 years. James's voice was rough from illness, weakened by the cancer eating away at him, but his words were clear and deliberate. He knew he was dying, had maybe 6 months left if he was lucky, and he was using whatever time remained to unburden himself of secrets he'd carried for decades. He told me he'd never married, never had children, had devoted his entire life to building the Hartwell family business empire. What had been worth maybe $50 million when his father died was now worth over $300 million through James's careful management and strategic investments. He'd been successful by any measure, respected in Boston's business community, lived a life of comfort and privilege. But he'd been lonely, and he'd been guilty. Robert was the good one, James told me, his voice cracking slightly. The brave one. I was a coward, Margaret. I let father bully him out of the family for loving you. I stood by and watched my brother get disowned for choosing his heart over money, and I did nothing to stop it. I didn't defend him, didn't argue on his behalf, didn't refuse my inheritance in solidarity. I just accepted that Robert was gone and took everything that should have been split between us. I've lived with that guilt every single day for 50 years. Every success I had in business felt hollow because it was built on betraying my brother. Every dollar I made was a reminder that Robert was struggling while I prospered. I wanted to ask him why he was telling me this now, what he expected me to do with this confession, what possible purpose it served to unburden his conscience onto me, decades too late to matter. I finally found my voice enough to ask the question. Why are you telling me this now, James? What do you want from me? Forgiveness? Understanding? Some kind of absolution before you die? Because I can't give you that. I'm not the one you betrayed. Robert was, and he's been dead for 15 years. You can't apologize to him. You can't make it right with him. So what's the point of telling me? There was a long silence on the other end of the line, just the sound of James breathing, labored and difficult. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, more vulnerable than before. Because I'm out of time, Margaret. Because I can't fix what I did to Robert, but maybe I can fix what was done to you, and because you deserve to know something that Robert never knew, something I made sure he never knew. Your husband never stopped being a Hartwell. He just stopped being welcomed like one. I didn't understand what James meant by that. Didn't know how Robert could still be a Hartwell when his family had completely cut him off, had removed him from wills and trusts and family gatherings, had treated him like he was dead. James must have heard the confusion in my silence because he continued without me asking. I need to tell you something, Margaret. Something I've kept secret for 35 years. I couldn't face Robert, couldn't reconcile with him, because that would have meant admitting I was wrong, and Father was wrong, and our whole family was wrong. My pride wouldn't let me do that. But I couldn't just stand by and do nothing while my brother struggled. So I helped. Anonymously, in ways he'd never trace back to me. Starting in the early 1990s, I started making payments on your mortgage. Not all of it, just portions here and there, enough to make a difference, but small enough that Robert would think it was a bank error in your favor or a payment processing mistake. Kept you from ever being late, from ever risking foreclosure during the hard times. My hands tightened on the phone, my breath catching in my throat. What? What are you talking about? James continued like he'd been waiting years to confess this, like the words had been building up pressure and were finally being released. When David went to college, his tuition and expenses, Robert was so proud that he'd saved enough to send his son to a good school. But that savings only covered half of what it actually cost. The other half came from me. Anonymous scholarships, grants that didn't quite exist, financial aid that was really just me, making sure my nephew got an education. Robert never knew. David never knew. I made sure it was untraceable. And when Robert died in 2009, when he had that heart attack and left you with a mortgage and bills and uncertainty, I paid off your house, completely. You probably thought it was some kind of insurance payout or banking error, but it was me, making sure my brother's widow wasn't left destitute because of choices my family forced him to make. I started crying, and they weren't sad tears. They were angry tears, hot and furious, running down my face while I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. You let me struggle? My voice came out harsh, accusatory, all the pain of the past 35 years compressed into those 4 words. You watched Robert work himself to death, watched him take every overtime shift, watched him sacrifice his health and his time and his life to provide for us, and you sent checks? You eased things just enough that we didn't lose everything, but not enough that Robert could rest, could relax, could stop killing himself to make ends meet? You were helping us while hiding, being a coward, salving your conscience with anonymous money instead of just being his brother? How dare you? How dare you help us like that and call it kindness when what Robert needed was family, not mystery payments. He needed his brother, not a secret benefactor. James was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel his pain through the phone line, but I didn't care. I wanted him to hurt. Wanted him to feel a fraction of what Robert had felt being rejected by everyone he'd grown up with. When James finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. You're right. I was still a coward. I helped, but I couldn't face him. I made things easier, but I couldn't give him what he really needed, which was family, belonging, acceptance. I've regretted that every day since he died, regretted that I never got to tell him I was sorry, that I was proud of him, that he was the better man between us. That's why I'm facing you now, Margaret. Because I can't apologize to Robert, but I can try to make amends to you. I can try to give you what you and Robert should have had all along if my family hadn't been so cruel and proud and stupid. I wiped my face, trying to compose myself enough to ask the obvious question. What are you talking about, James? What amends? What could you possibly give me now that would matter? And that's when James told me about the offer, about the real reason for his call, about the decision he'd made regarding his estate. Margaret, I have no heirs, no wife, no children, no one to leave my life's work to when I die. Under normal circumstances, everything would go to various charities and institutions, which is fine but impersonal. But I've been thinking about Robert, about what he would have inherited if father hadn't disowned him. Half of everything. That was supposed to be his birthright, his share of the family wealth. He lost it because he loved you. So I want to give it to you, not as charity, as inheritance, as what Robert's widow deserves. The estate alone, the family property on Boston Harbor that's been ours for 4 generations, it's currently valued at $47 million. 12 bedrooms, 6 acres, private dock, the whole thing. Then there's the trust and investments, my portion of the family wealth that I've grown over the years. Another $180 million, give or take, depending on market fluctuations. Total package, roughly $227 million. I want to transfer it to you, Margaret. I want you to have what Robert would have had. What you would have had together if my family hadn't been so hell-bent on punishing him for choosing love over money. I sat there in stunned silence, unable to process what I was hearing. $227 million. An amount of money I couldn't even conceptualize, that seemed fictional, that belonged in movies about lottery winners and billionaires, not in the life of a 68-year-old retired nurse from Pennsylvania. I finally found words, though they came out weak and confused. What about David, your nephew, Robert's son? Shouldn't he be the one to inherit the Hartwell family wealth? He has your blood, your brother's blood. I'm just the woman Robert married. James's response was immediate and firm. I've had David investigated, Margaret, thoroughly. For the past 6 months, I've had a private investigator watching him, documenting his life, his choices, his character. Do you want me to tell you what I found? Something in his tone made my stomach drop. Part of me wanted to say no, wanted to refuse the information, wanted to protect the image of my son, even though I knew it was already crumbling. But I needed to know. I needed the truth, no matter how painful. Yes. Tell me. James took a breath and began reciting facts like he was reading from a report, which he probably was. Your son has been planning to put you in a nursing home for at least 3 months, possibly longer. He and his wife have toured 4 facilities, compared pricing, discussed which of your assets they can access once you're declared incompetent. Vanessa has significant debts, shopping addiction primarily, $80,000 in credit card debt that she's been hiding from David. David knows about some of it, has been stealing from his employer to help cover the minimum payments. Small amounts, difficult to trace, but theft nonetheless. They've been telling people your house is theirs, have been planning renovations and changes, have been treating your property as their inheritance while you're still living in it. They've gone through your mail, searched your room for financial information, tried to determine if you have resources they can access. That's who your son is, Margaret. Still want me to include him in the inheritance? I sat there listening to James describe my son like he was a stranger, like he was some criminal being profiled, rather than the child I'd raised with love and sacrifice and hope for his future. But I couldn't deny any of it. Every fact James recited matched what I'd observed, what I'd overheard, what I'd documented in my journal over the past 3 months. David had become exactly who James was describing. The question was whether this was temporary, a phase brought on by financial stress and Vanessa's influence, or whether this was who he really was underneath the surface. I needed to know. I needed to give him one more chance to show me something different, to prove that the good man I'd raised was still in there somewhere. I made a decision in that moment, sitting in my bedroom with my phone pressed to my ear and my future hanging in the balance. I told James my terms. Give me 2 weeks. Let me see who David really is when he doesn't know he's being tested. If he shows me love, respect, basic human decency toward his mother, I'll tell you to include him in the inheritance. Split it between us or give him a portion, whatever you think is fair. But if he shows me who you say he is, if he proves that your investigation is accurate and this is his true character, then the money is yours to do with as you wish. 2 weeks, that's all I'm asking. James agreed immediately, said 2 weeks was more than fair, said he hoped David would surprise us both. That was September 1st. The confrontation where David screamed at me to pack my bags and get out of his house? That was September 14th. David had 2 weeks to show me he loved me. Instead, he showed me the door. And in doing so, he showed me exactly who he was. James's investigation wasn't wrong. If anything, it had been generous. Standing in that doorway, watching my son's face as he realized something was happening that he didn't understand, something he couldn't control, something that involved people and resources he knew nothing about. I felt powerful for the first time in 3 years. Not vindictive, not cruel, just powerful in the way you feel when you remember you're not actually helpless, when you reclaim agency you'd forgotten you had. For 3 years, I'd made myself small, accommodating, invisible in my own home. I'd apologized for existing, tiptoed around their schedules and preferences, accepted their disrespect because I was lonely and wanted family close, even if that family treated me terribly. But standing there with James Hartwell beside me and a Rolls-Royce at the curb and my suitcase packed, I wasn't small anymore. I was Margaret Eleanor Hartwell, and I was done shrinking. David's expression was cycling through emotions so rapidly I could watch them flash across his face like a slideshow. Confusion gave way to fear, fear gave way to calculation, calculation gave way to panic. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out like he wanted to physically stop me from leaving. "Mom, wait. We need to talk about this. You don't have to leave." His voice had completely changed from 10 minutes earlier when he'd been screaming at me to pack my bags. Now he was reasonable, conciliatory, the concerned son who just wanted to have a conversation. "Let's go inside and discuss this calmly. There's been a misunderstanding. We were just upset earlier. Things got heated. You know how arguments go. But we can work this out." Vanessa appeared at his shoulder, and I watched her brain working behind her eyes, processing the limousine and James's expensive suit, and the chauffeur and the neighbors watching from their windows. She was calculating, trying to figure out what this meant, whether there was an angle she could work, how to turn this situation to her advantage. Her entire demeanor changed in seconds, the hostile daughter-in-law replaced by someone warm and apologetic. "We were just emotional, Margaret. We didn't mean those things we said. Of course you don't have to leave. This is your home. We want you here." Her voice dripped with false sincerity, and watching her perform this transformation would have been impressive if it wasn't so transparent and insulting. I looked at both of them. At David, who'd screamed at me to get out less than an hour ago. At Vanessa, who'd spent 3 years making me feel unwelcome in my own house. And I spoke clearly so there would be no misunderstanding. Didn't mean what? Exactly? Didn't mean that I should go to a nursing home when you were literally looking at brochures and pricing? Didn't mean I should get out when you screamed those exact words at me? Or didn't mean this was your house when you've been telling everyone in the neighborhood that you own it? Which part didn't you mean? Because from where I'm standing, you meant every word. You just didn't expect me to actually leave. You thought I had nowhere to go, no options, no resources. You were wrong. David looked past me to James, and I could see him trying to make sense of this stranger's presence, trying to understand the connection. "Mom, seriously, who is this guy? Why is he here? What's going on?" James stepped forward, and even diminished by illness, he had a presence that commanded attention, that spoke of decades of authority and expectation of being obeyed. When he spoke, his voice was formal and cold, nothing familial or warm in it. "I'm James Hartwell, your father's brother. Your uncle. I've come to take Margaret home where she belongs, somewhere she'll be treated with the respect and dignity she deserves." 5 simple sentences that contained so much information. David's brain seemed to stall, trying to process it all. David's mouth opened and closed several times before sound came out. "Dad had a brother? I have an uncle? Why didn't anyone tell me?" He looked at me accusingly, like I'd deliberately hidden this information, like I was the one who'd kept family secrets. "Where have you been my whole life? Why am I just meeting you now?" The questions tumbled out, confusion and hurt mixing together. I'd always told David that his father's family had rejected us, but I'd been vague on details, hadn't wanted to burden him with the knowledge that his grandparents and uncle had considered him beneath their notice. Now he was standing face to face with that uncle, and I could see him trying to reconcile the rejection with the reality of this wealthy, powerful man on our porch. I answered before James could, my voice flat and factual. "Your father's family disowned him for marrying me, cut him off completely. We had no contact with them for your father's entire adult life. They didn't come to our wedding, didn't acknowledge you when you were born, didn't attend your father's funeral. As far as the Hartwells were concerned, Robert stopped existing when he chose me over their money and approval. That's why you've never met your Uncle James. That's why you never knew your paternal grandparents. They wanted nothing to do with us." I watched David process this, saw him looking at James with new eyes, reassessing based on this information. And then I watched the exact moment when David noticed details he'd overlooked in his initial shock. The quality of James's suit, hand-tailored and probably worth more than a month of David's salary. The Rolls-Royce at the curb, a vehicle that cost what some houses cost. The chauffeur, standing at attention, professional service that indicated serious wealth. The way James carried himself, that particular confidence that comes from never having worried about money a single day in your life. David's expression changed as the pieces clicked together, as he understood that his father's family wasn't just wealthy, but seriously, generationally, obscenely wealthy. "Are you?" His voice came out hesitant, uncertain. "Are you rich?" James looked at David with something approaching contempt, his lip curling slightly at the crudeness of the question. "Yes." One word. Simple and definitive. No elaboration, no softening, just acknowledgement of obvious fact. I watched David's brain recalibrate again, watched him realize that he was related by blood to serious money, that standing in front of him was a man who represented the Hartwell fortune his father had walked away from. And I saw the exact moment when greed overtook every other emotion on his face. His eyes lit up, his posture changed. He stepped forward with sudden enthusiasm, like they were old friends, reuniting instead of strangers, meeting for the first time. "Then I'm family!" David's voice was eager now, excited, like he'd just discovered buried treasure in his own backyard. "You're my uncle. I'm a Hartwell too. Dad was your brother, which makes me your nephew, your blood relative." His words came faster as he warmed to this new reality. "I can't believe we've never met before. There's so much I want to know about Dad's side of the family, about our family history. We should get to know each other. Maybe I could come visit you in Boston? We're family, Uncle James. We should act like it." He actually called James uncle, tried to claim relationship and connection that he'd known about for less than 5 minutes. The presumption was breathtaking, the transparent opportunism almost impressive in its shamelessness. James looked at David for a long moment, his expression neutral but his eyes cold and assessing. When he spoke, each word was measured and deliberate, designed to cut. "You're Robert's son. That's a biological fact I can't dispute. But that doesn't make you a Hartwell. My brother earned that name through his choices, his character, his integrity. He chose love over money, family over fortune, principle over comfort. He worked hard, sacrificed constantly, lived with dignity, despite being rejected by his own blood. He was a Hartwell in every way that matters. What have you earned, David? What have you sacrificed? What have you built through your own efforts? Because from where I'm standing, you're living rent-free in your mother's house while planning to put her in a nursing home so you can claim your inheritance early. That doesn't sound like Hartwell behavior to me." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. David's face went red, shame and anger competing for dominance. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. Couldn't form a defense because there was no defense. Couldn't deny the accusations because they were completely accurate. Vanessa, sensing that David was failing, that this situation was getting away from them, stepped forward to take control. She put on what I recognized as her professional voice, the one she used with clients, smooth and confident and persuasive. "Mr. Hartwell, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding here. We love Margaret. She's family. We'd never actually send her to a home. We were just exploring options for the future, planning ahead responsibly. Today was a misunderstanding. Emotions running high, things said in the heat of the moment that nobody actually meant. I'd been waiting for this moment, had prepared for exactly this backtracking and rewriting of history. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, held it up so both David and Vanessa could see it clearly. I have it recorded, 3 words that landed like grenades. I watched Vanessa's confident expression falter, watched David's eyes go wide with panic. Vanessa recovered first, but her voice had an edge of desperation now. "What? What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, I pulled up the recording app on my phone, the one I'd been using for 2 weeks to document every conversation, every cruel comment, every dismissal. I hit play and David's voice filled the porch, crystal clear and unmistakable. "If you don't want to go to a nursing home, then pack your bags and get out of my house." The recording continued for another 30 seconds, capturing the silence after his explosion, capturing Vanessa's satisfied laugh, capturing their conversation after I'd gone upstairs about how they'd finally be rid of me. I let it play while David and Vanessa stood frozen, while James listened with disgust clear on his face, while the neighbors who'd been watching from a distance could probably hear fragments carried on the afternoon breeze. When the recording ended, I put my phone back in my pocket and looked at my son. I started recording our conversations 2 weeks earlier, the day I decided to give you a test. The day I talked to James and learned about the family you never knew existed. I wanted to see who you really were when you thought there were no consequences. You failed spectacularly. The chauffeur, who'd been standing silently by the door this entire time, stepped forward and reached for my suitcase. Thomas, that was his name, handled my modest luggage like it was precious cargo, lifted it with care, and began carrying it down the path toward the limousine. David watched the suitcase being taken away, and something in him snapped. He lurched forward and grabbed my arm, his fingers wrapping around my wrist, hard enough to hurt. "You can't just leave." His voice was panicked now, all pretense gone, raw desperation taking over. "We need to talk about this. There are things we need to discuss. You can't just walk away." James moved faster than I would have expected from a man his age with his illness. He stepped between David and me, his body language protective and threatening simultaneously. His voice when he spoke was quiet but carried absolute authority, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Remove your hand from her. Now." It wasn't a request. David's hand released my arm instantly, involuntary obedience to that tone of command. He stepped back, looking scared for the first time, actually frightened of this uncle he'd just met. James didn't move, kept himself positioned between us, a physical barrier making it clear that David would have to go through him to touch me again. I stepped around James, looked at my son one final time. "David, you told me to leave. You screamed at me to pack my bags and get out of your house, so I'm leaving. I'm doing exactly what you demanded I do. You made your choice. Now you get to live with it." David was shaking his head, his eyes desperate, his entire body language pleading. "But Mom, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? You can't just... You need to. We should." His sentences fell apart, incomplete thoughts that revealed how thoroughly his world was crumbling. I gave him the simple answer. "I'll be staying at the Hartwell estate in Boston, with James, where family takes care of family." I didn't tell him I owned the estate. Didn't mention that just that morning, papers had been signed transferring the deed to my name, making me the legal owner of $47 million in property. Didn't explain that I wasn't going as a guest, but as the mistress of the house, that I'd be sleeping in the master bedroom that had belonged to Hartwell matriarchs for 4 generations. That revelation was coming. But not yet. Not standing on this porch with neighbors watching, and my son panicking, and my daughter-in-law calculating how to salvage this disaster. David would learn the truth soon enough. They both would. And when they did, when they fully understood what David had thrown away by throwing me out, the regret would be complete and permanent and entirely deserved. I was at the limousine. Thomas had opened the door for me, was standing at attention waiting for me to get in. The interior was visible, leather seats in pristine condition, probably more luxurious than any vehicle I'd ever been in. I could have stepped inside right then, could have left with my dignity intact and my point made. David was standing on the porch looking devastated. Vanessa was calculating her next move. James was waiting patiently beside the car. The neighbors were watching from windows and porches, witnessing the spectacle of Margaret Hartwell leaving in a Rolls-Royce after 3 years of being treated like she was invisible. It would have been enough. It should have been enough. But something made me stop. Something made me turn around. Maybe it was 42 years of being David's mother, of teaching lessons and hoping they'd stick. Maybe it was the businesswoman in me who believed in closing deals properly, in making sure all parties understood the terms. Or maybe it was just the satisfaction of watching someone realize exactly what they'd lost. I paused with my hand on the car door and turned back to face the porch. "David, I have a question for you." My voice carried clearly across the front yard, and I saw David's expression shift from despair to hope in an instant. He probably thought this was it, the moment when I'd change my mind, when maternal love would override everything else and I'd decide to stay after all. "Anything, Mom. Ask me anything." His voice was eager, desperate, willing to say whatever I wanted to hear if it meant I wouldn't leave. I walked a few steps back toward the house. Not all the way, just close enough that we could have a proper conversation without shouting. "This house. You called it your house earlier. Multiple times, actually. I'm curious why." David's face flushed and he stammered, trying to find words that wouldn't make him sound as bad as he knew he'd sounded. I meant, it's not that I think..." He stopped. Started again. "I just meant that it's the family home. I grew up here. Dad lived here. Eventually it'll be, when you're gone someday, which hopefully won't be for a long time, but eventually..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence without saying what we both knew he was thinking. Eventually this house would be his. Eventually I'd die and he'd inherit the property. Eventually, his patience in tolerating my presence would pay off in real estate. I let the silence stretch, let him hear his own words echoing in the air, let the ugliness of the sentiment settle over all of us. Eventually what, David? Finish the sentence. I wanted to hear him say it out loud. Wanted him to articulate the future he'd been planning without my input or consent. Vanessa, never one to let uncomfortable silence linger when she could fill it with her own voice, stepped in to say what David couldn't. He means, when you pass, Margaret, the house will go to him, obviously. As your only child, he's your heir. This is his inheritance. She said it matter-of-factly, like it was established law rather than an assumption she'd made, like my death and David's ownership of my property were inevitable linked events that required no actual planning or discussion. I looked at her and smiled, not warmly, not with humor, but with the satisfaction of someone holding cards the other players don't know about. Obviously, I repeated, letting the word hang there with all its implications. I shifted my attention back to David, softened my voice slightly, like we were just having a normal mother-son conversation instead of the most important discussion we'd ever have. Did your father ever tell you how we bought this house? David looked confused by the question, by the change in topic, but he answered readily. You took out a mortgage in 1985. You and Dad bought it right before I was born. I nodded. That's right. And when was it paid off? Do you remember? David's confidence grew slightly, probably relieved to be on safer conversational ground, to be discussing facts instead of feelings. After Dad died, 2009, you used the life insurance money to pay it off. That's what you told me. I smiled wider. That is what I told you. And I watched his face, watched him try to understand why I was bringing this up now, watched him not quite grasp what was coming. There was no life insurance, David. Not enough to pay off a mortgage anyway. Your father died with $12,000 in the bank and $8,000 in debt. That's what he left me financially. A net worth of $4,000 after 34 years of marriage and nearly 3 decades of working himself to exhaustion. David's face showed confusion, his brain trying to reconcile what I told him 10 years ago with what I was telling him now. Then how did you pay off the house? Where did the money come from? If there was no insurance payout, how did you manage to... He stopped, unable to finish, unable to imagine where a newly widowed woman would get the money to pay off a mortgage. I let him wonder for a few seconds. Let the question sit there unanswered, while I watched him try to solve a puzzle he didn't have the pieces for. I paid it off with my business. The money came from my business, the one I'd been running for 22 years by the time your father died. 4 simple sentences that clearly meant nothing to him because his confusion only deepened. What business? Mom, you worked at the hospital. You were in administration and then you became a nurse. What business are you talking about? I reached into my purse, the one I'd been carrying, and pulled out a business card I always kept with me. Cream-colored cardstock, professional printing, elegant and simple. I walked close enough to hand it to him, watched him take it, watched him read the words printed there. M.E. Bristol and Associates, Estate Sales and Liquidation Services, established 1987, and below that, contact information including the P.O. box he'd never known existed. I've run it for 37 years, David. I specialize in estate sales and liquidations. I help families sell properties and possessions when elderly relatives pass or move to care facilities. I evaluate items, determine their worth, facilitate sales, and take a commission. I'm very good at it. I have an excellent reputation. I make a substantial income. Enough to have paid off this house in full when your father died. Enough to have supported myself comfortably for the past 15 years. Enough to have been paying all the expenses for this household for the past 3 years, while you and Vanessa contributed nothing. David stared at the business card like it was written in a foreign language, turning it over in his hands, reading it again like the words might change or make more sense on second viewing. I don't understand. You never said anything about a business. You never mentioned this. His voice was small, confused, almost hurt like I'd deliberately deceived him. I gave him the truth plainly. You never asked. In 3 years of living here, sleeping in my house, eating my food, using my utilities, you never once asked how I supported myself, how I paid the property taxes that are $8,000 a year, how I covered the utility bills that you and Vanessa tripled with your habits, how I bought groceries for 3 people on a fixed income. You just assumed I was scraping by on Social Security and maybe a small pension. You assumed I was poor, struggling, barely managing. You never asked because you didn't care. You saw an old woman and made assumptions. You were wrong. I watched realization dawn on David's face, watched him understand that I wasn't the helpless elderly woman he'd constructed in his mind. I was a businesswoman, a property owner, Someone with resources and income and capabilities he'd never bothered to investigate or acknowledge. Someone who'd been supporting him while he planned to throw her away. The power dynamic he'd assumed, where he was the capable adult and I was the dependent parent, it had never existed. I'd been independent and self-sufficient the entire time, had been subsidizing his life while he treated mine as disposable. The expression on his face was almost comical. Shock and embarrassment and dawning horror all mixing together as the implications settled over him. Vanessa, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, found her voice again. Her tone was dismissive, trying to minimize what she'd just learned, trying to maintain some sense of control over a situation that was clearly slipping away from her. "Okay, so you have a little business. That's cute, Margaret. Good for you for staying active in your retirement. But this house, this property, it's still going to David eventually. You can run your little estate sale hobby, but the real asset here is this property. And when you're gone, it goes to family." She emphasized the last word like it was a trump card, like biology and legal relationship overrode everything else. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd been planning my removal for 3 years and delivered the truth she desperately didn't want to hear. "This house is mine, solely mine. Your name isn't on the deed, David. It never was. When your father and I bought this house in 1985, we bought it together, both our names on the mortgage and title. When he died in 2009, his half transferred to me automatically. I've been the sole owner of this property for 15 years. You have no legal claim to it, no ownership stake, no guarantee of inheritance. It's mine to do with as I please." David started to interrupt, but I held up my hand, not finished yet. "But you're my son," he managed to get out. "When you die, I'm your heir. This house will come to me. It's how inheritance works. Unless you have a will that says otherwise, everything goes to next of kin. That's me." His voice had an edge of panic now, the confidence draining as he started to understand where this was going. "When I die," I said slowly, deliberately, "this house will go to whomever I choose. And right now, standing here after you've thrown me out of my own home, after you've spent 3 years treating me like a burden instead of your mother, after you've planned to put me in a nursing home so you can claim your inheritance early, I'm choosing someone else." The words landed like physical blows. David actually stumbled back a step. Vanessa's mouth fell open. Even James, standing by the limousine, looked slightly surprised though pleased. I let the statement sit there for a moment, let them absorb it, let the reality sink in that their assumed future, the life they'd been planning in this house without me, had just evaporated. And then I delivered the final piece of information, the one that would hurt most. "I'm selling it. This house. The property you've been measuring and planning and redecorating in your minds, I'm putting it on the market. The papers will be filed Monday morning. I've already spoken to a real estate attorney, already had the property appraised, already selected an agent. In 3 to 6 months, this house will belong to someone else. Someone who will actually appreciate it. Someone who won't take it for granted. Someone who isn't you." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the neighbors who'd been watching from a distance seemed to stop moving. The whole world held its breath while David processed what I'd just said. "What?" The word exploded out of him, loud enough that I saw Mrs. Peterson jump on her porch 3 houses down. "You can't do that. You can't sell this house. This is my childhood home. This is where I grew up, where Dad lived. You can't just sell it because we had one fight." His voice climbed in pitch and volume, panic overriding any attempt at composure. "Where are we supposed to go? What are Vanessa and I supposed to do? We don't have anywhere else to live. We don't have money saved for rent and deposits. You can't just throw us out with nowhere to go." The irony of his words, the complete lack of self-awareness. It would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. I let him finish his rant. Let him hear himself. Let the echoes of his own earlier words bounce back at him. I looked at my son, the man I'd raised, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, and I gave him back exactly what he'd given me. "I don't know, David. Where was I supposed to go when you threw me out? Did you care then? Did you worry about whether I had resources or options or anywhere to land? You screamed at me to pack my bags and get out of your house without a single thought about where I'd go or how I'd survive. Now you're asking me to care about your situation when you couldn't be bothered to care about mine? That's not how this works. You made your choice. You chose Vanessa over your mother. You chose entitlement over gratitude. You chose your inheritance over our relationship. Now you get to live with those choices, and I get to live with mine. I turned away from the porch, from my son, from the house I'd lived in for 35 years, but that had stopped feeling like home the moment David started treating me like an unwanted guest. I walked back to the limousine where Thomas still stood holding the door. James gave me an approving nod as I approached, respect clear in his expression. Behind me I could hear David calling my name, his voice breaking, desperation bleeding through every syllable. "Mom, please, we can fix this. Don't leave like this, please." But I didn't turn around. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't give him the response or attention he was begging for. I'd spent 3 years making myself available, trying to build bridges he kept burning. I was done. I got in the limousine. The interior was exactly as luxurious as it had looked from outside, leather so soft it felt like sitting on a cloud, climate controlled to perfect temperature, equipped with every amenity someone might need. Thomas closed the door behind me with a soft, expensive click that sealed me into this new world, this new life, this future I hadn't fully chosen but was accepting with both hands. James got in from the other side, settled into the seat across from me, his face showing fatigue from the confrontation but satisfaction at the outcome. The engine started, that quiet, powerful sound, and we began to pull away from the curb. And as we drove away, slowly, giving me time to look, I turned in my seat and looked back one time. David was on his knees in the driveway, actually on his knees, like his legs had given out, his hands pressed to the pavement, his head bowed. He looked broken in a way I'd never seen him, defeated and lost and small. Vanessa was standing beside him screaming, her voice shrill but inaudible through the insulated windows of the Rolls-Royce. Her arms were flailing, gesticulating wildly, probably yelling at David or at me or at the universe for this turn of events she'd never anticipated. Neighbors had come out of their houses now, no longer pretending to be doing other things, just openly watching the spectacle of the Hartwell's implosion. Mrs. Peterson had her phone out, probably taking pictures or video. The Johnsons were standing in their yard, whispering to each other. The scene receded as we drove away, getting smaller in the distance until we turned the corner and it disappeared entirely. And I felt free. For the first time in 3 years, maybe for the first time since Robert died, maybe for the first time in my entire adult life, I felt completely, utterly free. Free from obligation to people who didn't value me. Free from making myself small to accommodate others' egos. Free from pretending that blood relation meant unconditional tolerance of abuse. Free from the weight of expectations I'd carried for decades. I was 68 years old, sitting in a Rolls-Royce, heading toward a $47 million estate that I owned, with resources David couldn't imagine, and a future that was entirely mine to determine. The woman who'd been invisible in her own home was about to become very, very visible. And David, the son who'd thrown away his mother for an inheritance he'd never receive, was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. The drive from my house in Pennsylvania to Boston is 4.5 hours under normal conditions, longer if traffic is bad around New York. James and I sat in silence for the first 20 minutes, both of us processing what had just happened, both lost in our own thoughts, while Thomas drove with professional precision. I watched the familiar streets of my neighborhood give way to the highway, watched the landscape change from suburban to rural to urban and back again. The interior of the Rolls-Royce was so quiet, so insulated from road noise, that I could hear my own breathing, could hear James shifting occasionally in his seat across from me. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy with unspoken thoughts, with questions that needed asking, with the weight of decisions made and relationships severed. Finally, James broke the silence with the question I'd been asking myself since the moment I'd stepped into this car. "Do you regret it?" His voice was quiet, careful, like he was afraid the question might shatter me. I turned from the window where I'd been watching Pennsylvania roll by and looked at him. "Which part?" I asked. Because there were so many things to potentially regret, so many choices I'd made in the past hour that could be questioned or second-guessed. James clarified, his eyes searching my face for signs of the maternal guilt he probably expected to find there. "Leaving him, walking away. He's your son, Margaret. No matter what he did, no matter how he treated you, he's still your son. That bond doesn't just disappear. I know what it's like to lose a brother, to have years of separation and regret. Are you going to be able to live with this choice?" I considered the question seriously, didn't just give him a quick answer designed to end the conversation. Did I regret leaving David standing in that driveway on his knees? Did I regret selling the house he'd assumed would be his? Did I regret choosing my own dignity and future over his comfort and expectations? I looked at James and gave him the truth. He stopped being my son when he started seeing me as an obstacle instead of a person. When he started calculating my remaining lifespan instead of cherishing my continued presence. When he decided his inheritance was more important than our relationship. I didn't leave my son today, James. I left a stranger who used to be my son. There's a difference. Maybe someday I'll regret it. Maybe someday the maternal instinct will override everything else, and I'll wish I'd stayed, wish I'd tolerated more abuse, wish I'd been smaller and quieter and more accommodating. But right now, no. I don't regret it. James nodded slowly, understanding in his expression, but also sadness. Robert would be heartbroken. He said it simply, stating fact, and the words hit harder than I'd expected. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I blinked them back, refused to let them fall. You're wrong, I told him, my voice firm despite the emotion. Robert would be furious, not at me, at what David became, at how his son treated his mother. Robert sacrificed everything because he valued love and family over money and status. He walked away from your family's fortune to be with me. He worked himself to exhaustion to provide for us. He died too young because of the stress of always struggling, always fighting to make ends meet. And his son repaid that sacrifice by throwing his mother out of her own house so he could claim an inheritance early. Robert would be devastated that David learned nothing from his example. But he wouldn't blame me for leaving. He'd support my choice to choose myself for once. James was quiet for a long moment, staring out his own window, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. You're right. Robert would be ashamed of his son. But he'd be proud of you. Proud that you built a business and supported yourself and didn't need anyone's permission to thrive. He always said you were the strongest person he knew, that you were wasted on domestic life, that you could have been anything you wanted if circumstances had been different. I used to think he was just being a devoted husband, seeing his wife through rose-colored glasses. But he was right. You are remarkable, Margaret. You always were. My brother saw it. I was too blind with prejudice and pride to see it. But I see it now. The admission hung between us, decades of regret compressed into a few sentences. James started talking about Robert then, sharing memories I'd never heard, stories from before I existed in Robert's life. He told me about their childhood in the Boston estate, about two brothers who'd been close before family expectations, and money drove a wedge between them. He described Robert as a boy, adventurous and kind, always the one defending smaller kids from bullies, always the one questioning their father's rigid rules and social expectations. He told me about the brother he'd abandoned for an inheritance, about watching Robert walk away from everything and feeling simultaneously horrified and envious of his courage. And I could hear in James's voice that this loss, the loss of his brother, had haunted him for 50 years. That all the money and success and business achievements hadn't filled the hole left by Robert's absence. I found myself talking about Robert, too, about the husband I'd lost 15 years ago but still missed every single day. I told James things I'd never told anyone, about the early years of our marriage when we'd been so poor but so happy, about how Robert never once blamed me for the life he'd given up, never resented the choice he'd made. I told him about Robert's death, how sudden it was, how I never got to say goodbye, how I'd spent 15 years wishing I could tell him one more time that choosing me had meant everything, that I'd loved him more than I'd ever loved anything. And James listened with tears in his eyes, hearing about his brother's life, the life he'd missed, the man Robert had become without family, wealth, or support. For the first time in 15 years, I was talking about Robert with someone who knew him before he was mine, someone who shared my grief, even if the source was different. For the first time, I fully understood something I'd known intellectually, but hadn't felt emotionally. I'd lost a husband, which was devastating and life-altering, and left a hole that would never completely heal. But James had lost a brother, and that loss was his own fault. He'd chosen money and parental approval over sibling loyalty. He'd let Robert walk out of his life rather than stand up to their father. He'd spent 50 years with that choice, 50 years of success and achievement built on the foundation of abandoning his brother when Robert needed him most. My grief was clean, pure, the natural sorrow of losing someone to death. James's grief was complicated, contaminated by guilt and regret and the knowledge that he could have made different choices. I didn't forgive him. Not fully. But I understood him in a way I hadn't before. The conversation shifted to practical matters as we crossed into Massachusetts, as the Boston skyline started appearing in the distance. James pulled out some papers from a briefcase he'd had with him, handed them to me. "The estate is yours," he said simply. "Legally transferred. Papers were signed this morning by my attorney. The deed is in your name. Everything is official and binding. I took the papers, looked at the legal language I only partially understood, saw my name, Margaret Eleanor Hartwell, listed as the owner of the property. Why? I asked him, looking up from the documents. You could live another year. 5 years. Doctors are wrong all the time. Why transfer everything now instead of waiting? Why not keep control while you're still alive? James smiled, sad and knowing. I have 6 months, Margaret. Maybe less. Pancreatic cancer doesn't leave much room for optimism or medical miracles, and I need to know that Robert's wife is taken care of before I die. I need to know that you'll be the one carrying the Hartwell name forward, that something good came from our family despite all the damage we caused. This is my last chance to do something right, to honor my brother the way I should have honored him 50 years ago. Let me have this. Let me know I fixed at least one thing before I go. I looked at this dying man, this stranger who was my brother-in-law, who'd wronged my husband but was trying to make amends too late, and I nodded. All right. Thank you. The words felt insufficient, but they were all I had. Then I asked the question that had been in my mind since the moment I'd agreed to leave. What about David? James looked at me carefully, assessing. What about him? I clarified, needing him to understand what I was asking. He's still a Hartwell, James, your nephew, Robert's son. Yes, he treated me terribly. Yes. He failed every test of character. But he's family. Doesn't that count for something? James was quiet for several long moments, the Massachusetts landscape rolling past outside, the Boston skyline getting closer. Finally he responded, and his answer was both simple and profound. That's your decision, Margaret. The estate is yours. The money is yours. Everything is legally transferred to you. If you want to leave it all to David after I'm gone, after you're gone eventually, I can't stop you. You get to decide who deserves the Hartwell legacy. I didn't answer him. Couldn't answer him. Because honestly, I didn't know. David had hurt me deeply, had betrayed my trust and my love, had shown me a side of himself I'd never wanted to see. But he was still my son. Still the baby I'd held, and the child I'd raised, and the man I'd hoped would be better than he turned out to be. Did being his mother mean I had to forgive him? Mean I had to provide for him despite his treatment of me? Mean I had to ensure his future was secure even after he'd tried to discard mine? Or was I allowed to choose differently, to let consequences be consequences, to pass the Hartwell fortune to someone more deserving? The question sat heavy in my chest as we drove toward Boston, toward my new life, toward a future I couldn't quite picture yet. The question of what I owed my son versus what I owed myself. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time, and maybe that was okay. We arrived at the estate at 9:30 in the evening. The sun had set an hour earlier, and darkness had settled over Boston, but the property was lit up like something from a movie, strategic lighting making the mansion and grounds visible even in the night. As we approached, massive iron gates opened automatically, some sensor or camera system recognizing the vehicle and granting us access without Thomas having to stop or announce our arrival. The driveway was long, easily a quarter-mile from the gates to the house itself, lined with old-growth trees that formed a canopy overhead. Even in darkness, I could sense the scale of the property, the careful landscaping, the wealth represented in every maintained inch. This wasn't just a house. This was a statement. This was generations of money and power made visible in stone and land and carefully cultivated beauty. And as we rounded the final curve and the mansion came fully into view, I understood exactly what I'd inherited. It was magnificent in a way that made my modest 3-bedroom ranch house seem like a cottage, made every home I'd ever lived in seem insignificant by comparison. 12 bedrooms, James had told me during the drive, built in 1880 by his great-grandfather who'd made his fortune in shipping. The architecture was classical, columns and symmetry and details that spoke of an era when homes like this were built to last centuries, to house dynasties, to intimidate visitors with displays of wealth and taste. The mansion overlooked Boston Harbor, positioned to capture views that were probably worth millions just for the location. Lights glowed in windows across 3 floors, making the white stone facade seem to glow against the dark sky. This was where James had grown up, where Robert had spent his childhood before walking away from it all. And now it was mine. The thought was so absurd, so disconnected from the reality I'd lived for 68 years, that I almost laughed. Thomas brought the car to a stop at the front entrance, a circular driveway with a fountain at its center, currently lit from below with lights that made the water look like liquid gold. Before I could reach for the door handle, it opened from outside, Thomas standing there ready to help me out. I stepped onto stone pavers, looked up at the entrance to what was now my home, and felt completely untethered from reality. James got out from his side, moved slowly, the journey having clearly exhausted him. He saw my expression, the shock and disbelief, and smiled gently. "Welcome home, Margaret." 2 words that felt impossible. This wasn't home. Home was a modest house in Pennsylvania, with Robert's fingerprints still on the door frames he'd painted. Home was the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, and the bedroom where I'd slept beside my husband for 24 years. This was something else entirely. This was a museum, an estate, a property. Not a home. Not yet. The front doors opened before we reached them, and a woman appeared, maybe 60 years old, dressed professionally but not formally, her expression warm and welcoming. "Mrs. Hartwell, welcome. I'm Eleanor Patterson, the estate manager. Mr. Hartwell told us you'd be arriving tonight. We've prepared the master suite for you." I shook her hand automatically, my brain struggling to process that there was a staff, that people worked here, that this property required management. James had mentioned it during the drive, but hearing it and seeing it were different things. Eleanor gestured for us to enter, and I walked into the foyer of the Hartwell estate for the first time as its owner, rather than as the rejected daughter-in-law who'd been thrown out of Catherine Hartwell's funeral 16 years earlier. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a property worth $47 million. High ceilings, original architectural details preserved and maintained, artwork that was probably worth more than I'd earned in my entire career, furniture that looked antique because it was antique, passed down through generations of Hartwells. Everything spoke of taste and wealth and history, of a family that had mattered in Boston society for over a century. Staff members appeared, introduced themselves, their names and roles washing over me in a blur I couldn't quite absorb. Eleanor, the estate manager. Thomas, the driver who'd brought us here. Margaret, the housekeeper, which made me smile because we shared a name. Gregory, the chef. Others whose names and functions I'd need to learn later when my brain was functioning properly. They all greeted me with respect and courtesy, like my arrival was expected and welcome. Like I belonged here. I felt like an imposter. James noticed my overwhelmed expression and took mercy on me. "Eleanor, let's show Margaret to her room. It's been a very long day." Eleanor nodded immediately, gestured toward a grand staircase that curved up to the 2nd floor. "Of course. If you'll follow me, Mrs. Hartwell." I followed her up those stairs, my hand trailing on a banister that was smooth from generations of hands, my feet finding carpeting so thick and plush it absorbed sound. James followed more slowly, his breathing labored from the exertion. The 2nd-floor hallway was wide enough to be a room itself, lined with portraits of Hartwell's past, serious faces staring out from oil paintings in heavy frames. Eleanor led me to a set of double doors at the end of the hall, opened them with a flourish, and stepped aside to let me enter first. The master suite was bigger than my entire 1st floor back in Pennsylvania. That was my first thought. The comparison, automatic and startling. A sitting area with a fireplace and sofas. A bedroom area with a 4-poster bed that looked like it belonged in a palace. A walk-in closet that was actually a room unto itself. A bathroom with marble surfaces and fixtures that probably cost more than my car. Windows that I knew would overlook the harbor in daylight. Everything decorated in elegant neutrals, expensive without being ostentatious, beautiful without being cold. "This is your room," Eleanor said, stating the obvious. "Mr. Hartwell had it prepared for you. Your belongings from the car have been brought up and are in the closet. If you need anything at all, there's a phone by the bed with direct lines to kitchen, housekeeping, and my office. Breakfast is typically served at 8, but please let us know your preferences and we'll adjust." She delivered this information efficiently, professionally, then excused herself with a small bow, actually bowed, and left me standing in the middle of a room that cost more than most people's houses. James lingered at the door, leaning against the frame, looking exhausted but satisfied. This was Robert's room when we were boys. We shared it until he was 12, and Father decided we were old enough for separate spaces. He loved the view of the harbor, used to sit at that window and watch the boats for hours. "I thought you should have it. Thought he'd want you here." I looked at this dying man who'd spent 50 years regretting his choices, who was trying to make amends too late for his brother to appreciate, and I felt gratitude and grief tangled together. "Thank you, James. For all of this. For bringing me here. For trying to make things right." He nodded, straightened up with effort. "Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." He left, closing the door behind him, and I was alone for the first time since leaving my house 6 hours earlier. I'd spent 3 years feeling small in a 3-bedroom house, making myself invisible, apologizing for existing in my own space. And now I was standing in the master suite of a $47 million mansion, the sole owner of a property that represented more wealth than I could conceptualize. It felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life, like at any moment someone would realize there'd been a mistake, and I'd be sent back to where I belonged. I walked to the window, looked out at darkness punctuated by lights from boats in the harbor, from the city in the distance, from the grounds below. This was real. This was happening. This was my life now. The thought was too big to fully grasp, too strange to feel true, too disconnected from everything I'd known for 68 years. I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror near the closet and stopped. Walked closer, looked at my reflection, really looked, searching for changes. But I was the same woman I'd been that morning when I'd looked in the mirror in my bedroom in Pennsylvania. Same gray hair, same lined face, same body that showed its 68 years. Nothing external had changed. I wasn't suddenly younger, or more beautiful, or more refined. I was still just Margaret, daughter of a steelworker and a seamstress, girl from a nowhere town who'd gotten pregnant at 19 and dropped out of college. But everything around me had changed. The reflection was the same, but the frame was completely different. Same woman, different life. I didn't know which version was more real, which one reflected who I actually was underneath all the circumstances and choices and random chance that had brought me to this moment. The emotion I'd been holding back since leaving David in that driveway, since stepping into the limousine, since the entire surreal drive to Boston, it finally broke through. I sat down on the edge of that enormous bed, and I cried. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere I couldn't name, tears that wouldn't stop, grief and relief and shock and exhaustion all pouring out at once. I cried for the son I'd lost, for the relationship that was broken probably beyond repair. I cried for Robert, for the husband who died too young and never got to reconcile with his family. I cried for the 3 years I'd spent being small and invisible and dismissed. I cried for the version of myself I'd buried under decades of being accommodating and pleasant and selfless. I cried because I was 68 years old, and my entire life had just changed in the span of 6 hours, and I didn't know how to process any of it. I cried until there were no tears left, until my body was empty, until the emotion had drained out, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I eventually composed myself enough to stand, to wash my face in that marble bathroom, to change into the nightgown that had somehow been unpacked and placed in the closet along with my other few belongings. My single suitcase looked pathetic in that enormous closet, my modest clothes hanging beside empty space designed for wardrobes I didn't own. I'd need to buy things, I realized. Couldn't live in a mansion like this with 3 outfits and 1 pair of shoes. The thought of shopping, of spending money on myself without guilt or justification, felt foreign and slightly wrong. I'd spent so many years being careful with money, even after my business became successful, that the idea of just buying things because I wanted them seemed almost immoral. I'd need to adjust. Would need to learn how to live in this new reality. Would need to figure out who Margaret Hartwell was when she wasn't struggling, or sacrificing, or making do with less. I climbed into that enormous bed. The mattress so comfortable it felt like floating, the sheets softer than anything I'd ever slept on. My phone was on the nightstand where I'd placed it, charging. I picked it up out of habit, checking for messages I didn't really expect. There was one, from an unknown number, but I knew who it was before I even opened it. "Mom, please call me. We need to talk. I'm sorry. Please. David." I stared at those words for a long time, at my son's first attempt at apology, at his plea for contact. Part of me wanted to respond immediately, wanted to fix things, wanted to be the mother who forgave and forgot and made everything okay. But I didn't. I deleted the message, blocked the number, and put my phone face down on the nightstand. I wasn't ready. Didn't know if I'd ever be ready. David had shown me who he was. I'd believed him. Now he'd have to live with the consequences while I figured out how to live with mine. That was the first of 47 text messages I'd receive over the next week from various numbers, David and Vanessa both reaching out, sometimes apologetic, sometimes angry, sometimes desperate, always wanting something from me. I didn't answer any of them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I'd spent 68 years answering other people's needs, responding to other people's demands, making myself available for other people's convenience. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself first. Choosing to process and heal and adjust on my own timeline without rushing to make anyone else comfortable. It felt selfish. It felt necessary. It felt like the only way forward. I turned off the light, lay back in that unfamiliar bed, in that unfamiliar room, in that impossible house, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I'd start figuring out what came next. Tonight, I just needed to rest. I'm going to tell you what happened in the next 6 months, from September, when I left David standing in that driveway, to February, when everything changed again. Because this isn't just a story about revenge, about a son who underestimated his mother and paid the price. This is a story about transformation, about a woman who spent her entire life being what other people needed and finally became what she needed for herself. It's about second chances and final chances and the choices we make when we know time is running out. It's about family, both the one you're born into and the one you choose. And it's about learning that sometimes the people who wrong you the most are the ones trying hardest to make things right when it's almost too late. So let me take you through those 6 months, day by day, decision by decision, moment by moment, until we get to the letter that changed everything. October and November of 2024 were months of adjustment and settling in. I learned the rhythms of the estate, the routines that kept a property this size functioning smoothly. I met with Eleanor every morning to discuss household matters, menus and maintenance, and staff schedules, things I'd never had to think about before. I learned the names of all 8 staff members, learned their stories, learned that they'd been worried about their futures when James got sick, relieved when he told them the estate would continue under new ownership. I explored the 12 bedrooms, each one decorated differently, each one holding memories of Hartwells who'd lived and died in this house over nearly 150 years. I walked the 6 acres of grounds, found gardens and pathways and hidden corners designed for privacy and contemplation. I stood at the dock watching boats in the harbor the way Robert had done as a boy. And slowly, gradually, the estate started feeling less like a museum and more like a place I actually lived. James's health declined rapidly during those first 2 months, faster than the doctors had predicted, the cancer aggressive and unforgiving. He'd been managing fairly well when he picked me up in September, still mobile and mostly independent, despite the pain and fatigue. By October, he needed a cane to walk. By November, he was in a wheelchair more often than not. But his mind stayed sharp, and we spent every evening together in the library, talking for hours, making up for 50 years of lost time. He told me stories about Robert I'd never heard, about their childhood adventures and teenage rebellions, and the gradual drift that happened when James chose their father's approval over his brother's friendship. I told him about my life with Robert, about the struggles and joys and ordinary moments that had made up our marriage. We were building a relationship, James and I, something neither of us had expected. A connection based on shared grief and mutual regret and the desire to honor Robert's memory properly. James started teaching me about the family business during those evening conversations, explaining the various investments and holdings that made up the Hartwell fortune, real estate in Boston and New York, stocks in established companies, bonds and trusts, and financial instruments I barely understood. He introduced me to his financial advisors via video calls, made sure they knew I was taking over, ensured the transition would be smooth when he died. I absorbed as much as I could, took notes, asked questions, tried to understand the machinery of wealth that would soon be my responsibility to manage. It was overwhelming. Learning to think in terms of millions instead of thousands, learning to make decisions that would affect not just my life, but the lives of staff members and business partners and charitable organizations that depended on Hartwell money. But I was good at learning, always had been. And James was a patient teacher. David kept calling during those months. Multiple times a day at first, from different numbers when I blocked the previous ones, leaving voicemails I didn't listen to, sending texts I didn't read. The calls came at all hours, early morning and late night, desperate attempts to reach me that I ignored with increasing ease. After the first week of silence from me, Vanessa started calling too, her messages alternating between apologetic and angry, sometimes begging for another chance, sometimes demanding I help them since they were family. I blocked every number, deleted every message unread, refused to engage. Eleanor asked once if I wanted her to change my number entirely, make it impossible for them to reach me. I considered it but decided against it. Let them call, let them leave messages, let them experience what it felt like to be ignored by someone they'd taken for granted. I wasn't ready to talk to David, didn't know if I'd ever be ready. The house in Pennsylvania sold in early November for $580,000, more than I'd expected in the current market. The buyers were a young family with 2 children, excited about the neighborhood and the schools, planning to renovate the kitchen and add a deck in the backyard. I felt nothing signing the papers, no nostalgia or regret or sense of loss. That house had stopped being home the moment David started treating me like an unwanted guest. Let someone else make happy memories there. Let children grow up loved in those rooms. Let it be what it was supposed to be, a home, not a waiting room for an inheritance. The sale proceeds went into my accounts, adding to the wealth I'd accumulated through M.E. Bristol and Associates. Money I'd earned, money that was mine, money David would never see. David and Vanessa were evicted from the house in mid-November, when the sale closed. They'd had 2 months to find somewhere else to live, 2 months to secure housing and move their belongings, more notice than they'd planned to give me when they were shopping for nursing homes. I heard through mutual acquaintances, people who felt compelled to update me on my son's situation, that they'd moved into a small apartment across town, that David was still working at his job, though under investigation for the theft James's private investigator had uncovered, that Vanessa's credit card debt had been discovered and was causing problems in their marriage. I listened to these updates with detachment, like hearing about strangers, feeling nothing beyond mild curiosity about how the story would end. They'd made their choices. They were living with consequences. That was how life worked. December brought the holidays. My first Christmas without David in 43 years. The staff decorated the estate beautifully, a tradition they maintained every year. Massive trees in the foyer and library, garland and lights throughout the house. Elegant and tasteful in that way. Old money does holidays. James was too sick to come downstairs by then, spent most of his time in bed, lucid for shorter periods each day. I sat with him on Christmas morning, just the two of us in his bedroom, and we talked about Robert, about what Christmas had been like when they were boys, about the traditions their family had maintained for generations. It was quiet and sad and strangely peaceful, sharing the holiday with someone who was clearly approaching the end. James gave me a gift that morning, a jewelry box that had belonged to his mother Catherine, Robert's mother, filled with pieces that should have gone to Robert's wife decades ago. I cried holding those jewels, thinking about the mother-in-law who'd rejected me, whose funeral I'd been thrown out of, whose belongings were now mine. James entered hospice care in early January. Though the hospice was provided at home, nurses rotating through to manage his pain and declining condition. His 6-month prognosis had been optimistic. He had weeks left, maybe days. I became his primary caregiver by choice, spent hours sitting with him, reading to him when he was too weak to talk, holding his hand through the worst pain, making sure he wasn't alone. The staff helped, of course, and the nurses were professional and kind. But I was the family now. Me, the woman he'd thrown out of his mother's funeral. Me, the sister-in-law he'd rejected for 50 years. Me, the only person left who'd loved Robert. It was a role reversal neither of us had anticipated, and one day, when James was lucid and the pain was managed enough for conversation, he acknowledged it. "I don't deserve this kindness," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his hand weak in mine. "After everything I did, everything I didn't do, all the years I wasted, you should hate me, Margaret. You should leave me to die alone the way I let Robert live alone." I looked at this dying man, this stranger who'd become something like family over 4 months, and I told him the truth. Neither did I, James. Neither did I deserve kindness from David, the son I raised and sacrificed for. But we don't always get what we deserve, good or bad. We get what we get. And right now, what you're getting is someone who'll make sure you don't die alone. Because that's what Robert would have wanted. That's what family does. He cried then, tears sliding down his gaunt face. Grief and gratitude mixing together in a way that needed no words. David showed up at the estate one day in late January. I didn't see him, wasn't even aware he'd come until Eleanor told me afterward. He'd driven all the way from Pennsylvania, had somehow found the address, despite my never telling him, had shown up at the gates demanding to see his mother. Security had turned him away per my standing instructions that David Hartwell was not to be admitted to the property under any circumstances. He'd argued with the guards, had shouted that I was his mother, and he had a right to see me. Had caused enough of a scene that they'd threatened to call the police. Eventually he'd left, but not before leaving a letter with the guards, asking them to make sure I got it. Eleanor brought it to me that evening, a sealed envelope with my name on it in David's handwriting. I looked at it for a long time, turning it over in my hands, wondering what words it contained. Then I put it in my desk drawer unopened. I wasn't ready. Not yet. James died on February 4th, 2025, peacefully in his sleep with me holding his hand. I'd been sitting with him all night, knowing the end was close, not wanting him to be alone when it came. The hospice nurse was there too, monitoring his vitals, but it was my hand he held as his breathing slowed and then stopped. He was 76 years old, had lived a long life by most measures, but it felt too soon. Felt like we'd just started building something that could have mattered. I cried for him, for the brother Robert had lost, for the relationship that could have been, for the waste of 50 years spent apart over pride and money and stubbornness. The nurse made the necessary calls, and within hours the machinery of death was in motion. Funeral home and lawyers and all the administrative details that follow when someone wealthy dies. I organized the funeral myself, a small service at the family church in Boston, where Hartwells had been married and buried for generations. It was private, just staff and James's business associates and a few distant cousins who'd remained in contact, maybe 30 people total. Dignified and quiet, exactly what James had wanted. The minister spoke about James's business achievements and charitable work, about his devotion to the family legacy, about his final months spent making peace with the past. I spoke too, briefly, about the brother he'd loved and lost, about regret and redemption, about the importance of fixing what we can while we still have time. I didn't tell David about the funeral, didn't inform him his uncle had died, didn't give him the chance to come and make it about himself. James's death and burial were private, family only. And David had shown me he wasn't family anymore. The will reading happened a week later, in the estate's library, the lawyer who'd helped James transfer the property, reading the formal document to me and Eleanor and the estate's financial advisor. Most of it was expected. I inherited everything. The total estate valued at $227 million, including the property, the investments, the trusts, the business holdings, everything James had accumulated over a lifetime. The amount still didn't feel real, still seemed like numbers on paper rather than actual wealth I could access and use. But it was mine now, legally and completely. I was one of the wealthiest women in Boston, owned a property that had been featured in architectural magazines, had resources that could support multiple generations. It was absurd. It was real. It was my responsibility now. The lawyer finished reading the will, closed the folder, and looked at me seriously. "There's one condition, Mrs. Hartwell. Not a legal condition exactly, more of a final request from James that I'm obligated to convey." I felt my stomach tighten, wondering what James had asked, what obligation he'd placed on this inheritance. What condition? The lawyer pulled out a sealed letter, handed it to me across the desk. "James wanted you to reach out to your son. Once. Give him one chance to explain himself, to apologize, to show you he's capable of change. You don't have to forgive him. You don't have to restore the relationship. You don't even have to see him if you don't want to." But James felt strongly that David deserves one opportunity to make things right. He asked that you read whatever David has to say before making final decisions about your estate planning. This letter explains his reasoning. I took the letter, felt its weight in my hands, thought about the other letter still sitting unopened in my desk drawer upstairs. David's letter from January, the one he'd left at the gates, the one I'd been avoiding for weeks. James's final request was that I read it, that I give my son one more chance. I looked at the lawyer and nodded slowly. "All right. I'll read it. I'll think about what James asked, but I'm not making any promises beyond that." The lawyer seemed satisfied with that answer, gathered his papers, and left me alone in the library with two letters that might change everything depending on what they said. That night, after the staff had gone to bed, after the estate was quiet and dark, I finally opened David's letter. The one he'd left at the gates, the one I'd been avoiding for 6 weeks. What it said changed everything. Changed how I saw the past 6 months, changed what I thought I knew about my son, changed the ending of this story in ways I never could have predicted. But before I tell you what that letter said, you need to understand something. You need to know what happened next. David's letter was 7 pages long, handwritten on lined notebook paper, the kind you buy at drugstores, not the expensive stationery I was now surrounded by. The handwriting was messy, rushed in places, shaky in others, with visible water stains that could only be tears. Some words were smudged where his hand had dragged across wet ink. This wasn't a carefully composed document. This was raw emotion poured onto paper, written by someone who needed to say things whether or not anyone would listen. I sat at the desk in the library, the same desk where James's will had been read hours earlier, and I unfolded those 7 pages with hands that weren't quite steady. I'd avoided this letter for 6 weeks, had left it unopened in my drawer while James died, and I inherited millions and my entire life transformed. But James's final request had been clear. Give David one chance. Read what he has to say. So I read it. I'm going to share parts of it with you now, the sections that mattered most, the words that changed how I understood everything that had happened. Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to even read this. Security told me you gave instructions that I'm not allowed on the property, that I'm not welcome, that I should stop trying to contact you. I understand. I deserve that. But I need to say this anyway. Need to get it out even if these words never reach you, even if this letter ends up in the trash unread. Vanessa left me 2 days after you did. 2 days. Turns out she was only interested in the house, in what she thought I'd inherit, in the life she thought I could provide once you were gone. When that disappeared, when you sold the house and left with your uncle, when it became clear there was no inheritance coming, she was done with me. Packed her things while I was at work, left a note on the kitchen counter. Didn't even have the decency to tell me to my face, "I'm living in a motel now, Mom. The kind that rents by the week, with stains on the carpet and noise through the walls. It's all I can afford. I lost my job 3 weeks ago. They found out I can barely write this. I'd been stealing, small amounts over several months, a few hundred here and there, telling myself I deserved it, that the company owed me, that I needed it to keep up with Vanessa's spending. I told myself a lot of things over the past 3 years, that you were getting old and needed to be in a facility, that the house was basically mine anyway, so I had a right to make decisions about it, that Vanessa was right about everything and you were wrong about everything, that I was the victim in our situation. I lied to myself constantly, created a whole narrative where I was the good guy and you were the problem. It's amazing what you can convince yourself of when you want something badly enough. The truth is, I became someone Dad would hate, someone you should hate, someone I hate when I look in the mirror. I remember when I was 7 years old and Dad died. That day you came to get me from school early, your face telling me something terrible had happened before you even said the words. I remember you holding me while I cried, remember you crying too but trying to be strong for me. You said, "We're going to be okay, David. I'll take care of us. I promise we'll be okay." And you did exactly that. You worked 2 jobs when you needed to, pulled double shifts at the hospital, went back to school at night to get better qualifications. You came to every single one of my soccer games, even when you were exhausted from working all day. You helped me with homework you barely understood, staying up late to figure out algebra so you could explain it to me. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, told me I could be anything I wanted, sacrificed your own needs so I could have opportunities. You were the best mother anyone could ask for, and I repaid you by treating you like garbage. I repaid your decades of sacrifice by moving into your house and treating it like mine, by letting Vanessa disrespect you in your own home while I said nothing, by going through your mail and searching your room for information about your finances, by planning to put you in a nursing home so we could have your space, by screaming at you to get out, by putting my hands on you, grabbing your arm, something I still can't believe I did. I put my hands on my mother in anger. Dad would have disowned me for that alone, would have thrown me out himself if he'd seen it. I don't have excuses, Mom. I can't blame Vanessa even though she encouraged everything. I can't blame financial stress even though that was real. I made choices. I chose to be cruel. I chose to be selfish. I chose to see you as an obstacle instead of as my mother. Those were my choices and I have to live with them. I don't want your money, Mom. I know you probably think this whole letter is leading to asking for money, for help, for something. It's not. I saw the news articles about you inheriting the Hartwell estate. I looked up the property value online. I know you're wealthy now beyond anything I ever imagined. I know that if I'd just been patient, if I'd just been kind to you, I probably would have been included in that somehow. I know I threw away millions by throwing you out, and I don't care. I care that I was so stupid and short-sighted, but I don't want the money now. That's not why I'm writing. I just want to tell you I'm sorry. I just want you to know that I see what I did. I understand how wrong it was, and I'm trying to be better. Trying to become someone who deserves a mother like you, even if it's too late for us. I got a job, just warehouse work at a distribution center, minimum wage, overnight shift, loading trucks, and moving boxes. It's hard physical labor, and it doesn't pay much, but it's honest. Nobody there knows who I am or what I did. I show up, I do my work, I go home. It's the first time in years I've earned money without cutting corners or stealing or feeling entitled to more than I'm worth. I'm in therapy too, seeing a counselor twice a week at a community clinic that works on a sliding scale, trying to understand how I became the person who could scream at his mother to get out, trying to face what I did instead of making excuses for it. It's hard work, harder than the warehouse job, looking at yourself honestly and not liking what you see. But I'm doing it because I need to change, not to get you back, not to get an inheritance, just because I can't keep being who I was. I don't expect you to be in my life, Mom. I don't expect phone calls or visits or reconciliation or anything. You deserve peace. Deserve to enjoy your new life without the burden of a son who treated you terribly. But I needed you to know this. You deserved better. You deserved a better son than the one you got. You deserved gratitude instead of entitlement. You deserved respect instead of dismissal. You deserved love instead of cruelty. Everything you gave me, all the sacrifices you made, you deserved to have that honored and appreciated, and I failed completely at that. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but it's all I have. I love you, Mom. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Your son, David. The letter ended there, his signature shaky, a final water stain blurring the ink where tears had fallen. I read the letter 3 times, front to back, absorbing every word, trying to determine if it was genuine or manipulation, if this was real remorse or another attempt to get something from me. The first reading, I was skeptical, guarded, looking for signs of deception. The second reading, I started to hear David's voice beneath the words, started to recognize my son in the admissions and apologies. The third reading, I cried, tears falling onto the same pages David's tears had marked, grief and hope mixing together in my chest. This letter didn't undo what he'd done. Didn't erase the cruelty or the betrayal or the months of being made to feel invisible in my own home. But it suggested something I hadn't dared hope for. That maybe, just maybe, the good man I'd raised was still in there somewhere. That maybe hitting rock bottom had cracked through the entitlement and selfishness to reveal something salvageable underneath. I set the letter down and looked around the library, at the books that had belonged to generations of Hartwells, at the furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries, at the wealth and privilege surrounding me now. And I talked to James's memory, to the uncle who died a week ago, whose final request had brought me to this moment. What should I do, James? You asked me to give David a chance. You believed in second chances even though you waited too long to take yours with Robert. Is this letter enough? Is remorse enough? How do I know if he's really changed, or if he's just saying what I want to hear? I sat in silence, waiting for an answer that wouldn't come, waiting for clarity that had to come from within myself rather than from anyone else. I thought about my own parents, Thomas and Eleanor Bristol, the steelworker and seamstress who'd sacrificed everything so I could go to college. I thought about the phone call I'd made when I was 19, telling them I was pregnant, terrified they'd be disappointed or angry or disown me the way Robert's family had threatened to disown him. I remembered my mother's response, calm and loving and immediate. We'll figure it out together, Margaret. You're our daughter and we love you. Mistakes don't change that. They'd forgiven me for getting pregnant, for dropping out of school, for all the ways I'd disrupted the future they'd planned. They'd loved me through my failures. Didn't I owe David the same grace? I thought about Robert, about the husband I'd lost 15 years ago, but whose influence still shaped every decision I made. Robert had believed in second chances, in forgiveness, in the possibility of change. He'd forgiven his parents over and over for small slights before the final disowning. He'd believed people could be better than their worst moments. What would he tell me to do about David? I knew the answer without having to guess. He'd tell me to call him, to give him a chance, to remember that being someone's parent didn't end just because they hurt you. That love, real love, survived damage and distance and even betrayal. That family meant showing up even when it was hard. Robert would tell me to be brave enough to risk being hurt again if there was any chance of healing what was broken. I made a decision sitting in that library, surrounded by wealth I'd never expected and grief I'd never finished processing. James had asked me to give David one chance. David's letter suggested he'd used the past 6 months the same way I had, to transform, to become someone different than who he'd been. Maybe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. But I'd never know unless I took the risk of finding out. I picked up the phone on the desk, the one with direct lines to every room in the estate and outside connections as well. I pulled out David's letter, found the phone number he'd written at the bottom. A number I didn't recognize from a phone he must have bought after I'd blocked all his previous ones. My hand shook slightly as I dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I almost hung up. And then David answered, his voice uncertain and small. Hello? And I said the words I hadn't said in 6 months. Hello, David. It's Mom. We need to talk. We met at a diner. Not a fancy restaurant where the Hartwell name would mean something. Not at the estate where the wealth disparity would be too obvious. Not even at a coffee shop where we might run into people we knew. A diner, neutral ground. The kind of place with vinyl booths and laminated menus and coffee that came in thick ceramic mugs. March 15th, 2025. Exactly 6 months after, David had screamed at me to pack my bags and get out of his house. I'd chosen the date deliberately, wanted the symmetry of it, wanted David to recognize the significance. 6 months since everything fell apart. 6 months of silence and separation and transformation on both sides. 6 months to figure out who we were when we weren't mother and son living under the same roof. I arrived 15 minutes early, slid into a booth near the back, ordered coffee I didn't drink, and waited. David arrived exactly on time, and the first thing I noticed was how different he looked. Tired, older than his 43 years, with circles under his eyes and a humility in his posture I'd never seen before. He'd lost weight, not in a healthy way, but in the way people do when they're stressed and not eating properly. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind you buy at discount stores when you're rebuilding from nothing. He saw me and hesitated, like he wasn't sure he had permission to approach, like he thought I might change my mind and leave. Then he walked over slowly, slid into the booth across from me, and we sat in awkward silence for several long seconds. Neither of us knew how to start this conversation, how to bridge 6 months of absence, how to address everything that had happened between us. Finally, I broke the silence with the most honest observation I had. "You look terrible." It wasn't kind, but it was true, and I decided during the drive here that I wasn't going to soften things or pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. David looked at me and something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. "I feel worse," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't been sleeping well. "Good," I replied, and I meant it. He should feel terrible, should look like someone who'd spent 6 months confronting what he'd done and who he'd become. If he'd shown up looking refreshed and happy and unaffected, I would have known the letter was manipulation. But this exhausted, humble version of my son suggested the remorse might be real. We almost smiled then, both of us, a tiny moment of connection that felt fragile and tentative but real. The waitress came over, and we ordered coffee for both of us, nothing else, neither of us there to eat. When she left, I launched into what I'd come to say, the boundaries I needed to establish before anything else could happen. "I'm not giving you money, David. I need you to understand that, from the beginning. Whatever happens between us moving forward, it's not going to involve me rescuing you financially, or supporting you, or giving you access to the Hartwell fortune. That needs to be clear." David nodded immediately. "I know. I didn't come here for money." "I know," I repeated, because I'd read his letter enough times to believe that particular claim. But I needed to hear him say it out loud, needed to establish this boundary explicitly so there could be no confusion later. "I'm not giving you the estate either. When I die, the Hartwell property and assets will go wherever I decide they should go, and you need to accept that it might not be to you." "I know," David said again, his voice smaller this time, the reality of permanent consequences settling over him visibly. "Your father and I raised you to be better than what you became. We taught you values, modeled behavior, showed you how to treat people with respect and gratitude. We sacrificed so you could have opportunities and security. And you took all of that, and you became someone cruel and entitled and ungrateful, someone who saw his mother as an obstacle instead of a person, someone who could scream at the woman who gave him life to get out of her own house. Your father would be ashamed of you, David. I'm ashamed of you, and you should be ashamed of yourself." "I know," David said, for the third time, and now he was crying, tears sliding down his face that he didn't try to hide or wipe away. "I know, Mom. I know all of that. I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to become someone you and Dad could be proud of. I don't know if I can, but I'm trying." I watched my son cry across the table from me in a diner booth, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever fully, but something softer than the anger I'd been carrying. Something that acknowledged he was suffering, that the consequences had landed, that maybe the punishment fit the crime. I took a breath and delivered the second part of what I'd come to say, the reason I'd agreed to this meeting in the first place. "But if you're serious about changing, if you really are doing the work and becoming someone different, then I'll help you. Not with money, not with bailouts or handouts or making your life easier, but with guidance, with accountability, with second chances the way my parents gave me second chances when I disappointed them. The way your father gave people second chances because he believed people could be better than their worst moments." David looked up at me, confusion and hope mixing on his face. "Why? Why would you help me after what I did? Why would you give me anything at all?" I could have given him a dozen reasons. Because James had asked me to in his final request. Because Robert would have wanted me to. Because cutting him off completely felt too much like what the Hartwells had done to Robert, and I didn't want to repeat that pattern. But I gave him the simplest truth. Because I'm your mother, David. And that still means something to me, even if it stopped meaning something to you for a while. Being your mother isn't conditional on you being perfect or even being good. It's just a fact. You're my son. I'm your mother. And I get to decide what that means, and I'm deciding it means I don't give up on you completely, even when you deserve it. We didn't hug. The moment wasn't right for physical affection. The distance between us still too great to cross with an embrace that would feel forced and premature. But David wiped his face and looked at me with something like gratitude mixed with disbelief. Thank you, Mom. Thank you for even talking to me. Thank you for this chance. I appreciate it more than you know. I held up my hand, stopping that line of conversation before it could continue. Don't thank me, David. Don't tell me how grateful you are or how much you appreciate this. Prove it. Prove you're serious about changing. Stay in therapy. Keep working that honest job. Build a life based on who you actually are instead of who you think you're entitled to be. Show me through your actions that you've learned something from all this. And then maybe, in a year or 5 years or 10 years, we can talk about what our relationship looks like. But words are cheap. I need to see change, not just hear about it. David nodded, understanding settling over his features. I can do that. I will do that. We finished our coffee in slightly less awkward silence, talked briefly about his therapy and his warehouse job and the small apartment he'd moved into. I didn't tell him details about the estate or my life, kept things surface level, maintained the boundaries I needed. After 30 minutes, I stood to leave. David stood too, looking like he wanted to say more but didn't know what. I'll call you next week, I told him. We can talk on the phone, check in, see how things are going. But this is going to be slow, David. This is going to take time. Don't expect quick forgiveness or instant restoration. Expect to do the work for a long time before you see results. He agreed readily, walked me to my car, watched me drive away with an expression I couldn't quite read. That was 2 months ago, sitting here now in early May of 2025. David and I talk once a week, Thursday evenings at 7 o'clock, a standing phone call that lasts about 30 minutes. He tells me about his therapy sessions, about what he's learning, about the mistakes he's recognizing and the patterns he's trying to break. He tells me about his warehouse job, about the coworkers he's getting to know, about the satisfaction of earning an honest paycheck even if it's barely enough to live on. He asks about my life in general terms, and I give him vague answers. We're not at the point yet where I share details about my daily routine or my plans or my feelings. He doesn't ask about the money, doesn't ask about the estate, doesn't hint or manipulate or try to position himself for future inheritance. If it's an act, it's a convincing one. If it's real, then maybe there's hope. Will I ever forgive him completely? I honestly don't know. Some hurts go too deep to ever fully heal. Some words once said can't be unsaid. Some actions can't be undone. The version of our relationship that existed before, when I trusted him completely and assumed he'd always value me, that relationship is dead. We're building something new now. Something more honest maybe. Something based on reality instead of assumptions. It's not the mother-son relationship I thought I had. It's smaller, more careful, protected by boundaries that didn't exist before. But it's something. Whether it grows into real reconciliation or remains this cautious distance, time will tell. I'm not in a hurry to decide. For the first time in my life, I'm letting things unfold at their own pace instead of rushing to fix or force or make everything okay. Will David ever be the son I thought I raised? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe that son never existed and I was seeing what I wanted to see instead of what was actually there. Or maybe that son did exist and got lost somewhere along the way and is finding his way back. Or maybe he's becoming someone new entirely, someone neither of us has met yet. I don't know. What I do know is that I can't control who David becomes. I can only control who I am and what I choose to accept. And I'm choosing to give him space to grow while maintaining my own boundaries and dignity. I'm choosing to be his mother in a way that doesn't require sacrificing myself. I'm choosing hope without being naive. That's the best I can do. But I learned something through all of this. Something that took 68 years and a son's betrayal and a mansion in Boston to finally understand. Respect isn't automatic. Not even from your own children. Not even after decades of sacrifice and love and putting their needs before your own. You can do everything right and still end up being treated like you're disposable. And when that happens, you have a choice. You can make yourself smaller, quieter, more accommodating, hoping that if you just take up less space, they'll value you again. Or you can remember who you are and refuse to shrink. You can choose your own dignity over their comfort. You can walk away from people who don't appreciate you, even when those people are your own children. Even when walking away means rewriting your entire understanding of family and obligation and what you owe to people who share your blood. And you should never, ever make yourself small to fit into someone else's idea of who you should be. I spent 3 years being invisible in my own home, apologizing for existing, trying to be whatever version of myself David and Vanessa would find acceptable. I made myself so small, I almost disappeared completely. And the smaller I became, the less they valued me. Because people don't respect what they can take for granted. They respect what has value, what has power, what demands to be seen. I'm done being small. Done apologizing for taking up space. Done making myself invisible so others can feel bigger. I'm Margaret Eleanor Bristol Hartwell, and I'm nobody's burden. I'm nobody's afterthought. I'm nobody's obstacle or problem to be solved. I'm just me, finally, after 68 years of being everyone else's version of who I should be. I'm 68 years old. I'm a multi-millionaire with assets worth over $200 million. I live in a 12-bedroom mansion on Boston Harbor with a staff of 8 and views that people pay money just to photograph. I own property that's been featured in architectural magazines and historical registries. I have resources that could support multiple generations, that could fund charities and businesses and dreams I haven't even imagined yet. That's all true. That's my reality now. But more importantly, more fundamentally than any of that external wealth and circumstance, I'm Margaret Eleanor Bristol Hartwell. I'm the daughter of a steelworker who believed in me. I'm the wife of a man who chose love over money. I'm a businesswoman who built something from nothing. I'm a mother who loved her son enough to let him face consequences. I'm a woman who learned her worth. And I'm nobody's burden. I'm nobody's afterthought. I'm just me. Finally. Completely. Unapologetically. Me. If this story touched you in any way, if you saw yourself in Margaret or recognized someone you know in David, if you've ever felt invisible or underestimated or dismissed by people who should have valued you, please share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with the woman who's making herself small in her own home. Share it with the parent being taken for granted by adult children. Share it with anyone who's forgotten their own worth because they've been treated as worthless for too long. Stories have power. They remind us we're not alone. They show us possibilities we couldn't see on our own. They give us permission to choose ourselves when we've spent our whole lives choosing everyone else. This story is for anyone who needs that permission. And drop a comment right now telling me what you would have done. Would you have forgiven David the way Margaret is slowly, carefully trying to? Would you have cut him off forever and never looked back? Would you have responded to his letter or left it unread? Would you have taken James's offer or walked away from the inheritance? There's no right answer. Every person's situation is different. Every relationship has its own history. Every choice comes with consequences we can't fully predict. But I want to know what you think. I want to know if Margaret's choice resonates with you, or if you would have chosen differently. This community is growing, and your voice matters. Your experience matters. Your perspective adds something valuable to this conversation. So tell me, what would you have done? Thank you for spending the past 2.5 hours with me, listening to this story, staying through every twist and revelation and difficult decision. Your time is precious, maybe the most precious resource any of us have, and you chose to spend it here. I hope this story was worth it. I hope it gave you something to think about, something to feel, maybe something to apply to your own life and relationships. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about Margaret's story, about what happened to her and what she chose to do about it. Stories only matter when someone hears them. You made this story matter by being here. Thank you.